Klay Thompson and Kevin Love, two guys who I believe are destined to be Basketball Hall of Famers. One player was a member of the 2016 championship team, and the other player was a cornerstone piece of a dynasty, as Thompson and the Warriors won a total of 4 championships together. At this point in time, I think people pretty much unanimously agree which player had the more impressive career, and which player ranks higher on the all-time list, which would be Klay Thompson. The thing is, this wasn't always the perception between the two players, and many years ago, these two guys were involved in some major trade discussions, and the deal was very close to materializing. Let me explain the context of the situation. It was the summer of 2014. The Warriors were a young and upcoming team with their core of Steph Curry, Klay Thompson, and David Lee. The Warriors did have Draymond Green as well, but at that point, he was only in his second season, and wasn't even a starter yet, so the power forward position did appear to be an area where they could improve. They had just won 51 games in a strong Western Conference, but they had also been eliminated in the first round by the Clippers, and almost no one in the basketball community was considering Golden State as a serious title contender in the near future, as they were an inexperienced jump shooting team. Klay Thompson was only 24 years old, and at that point, he had never reached the status of an all-star. He was coming off a season where he averaged just 18 points, 3 rebounds, and 2 assists on 44% shooting. Although there were glimpses of great potential, almost no one could tell just how good he was going to become. Then on the other hand, there was Kevin Love and the Minnesota Timberwolves. The T-Wolves just had a 40-42 season and missed the playoffs, as it was pretty evident that they were nowhere near the status of a contender. With that being said, Kevin Love was playing at an elite level to say the least, as he was coming off a season where he averaged a whopping 26 points, 12.5 rebounds, and 4.5 assists. To put his impressive season in perspective, Love was 4th in the league in points per game, 3rd overall in rebounds per game, he was 1st among power forwards in assists per game, and he just broke the franchise record for the most three-pointers made in a single season. And on top of all of that, he was still only 25 years old. At the time, he legitimately looked like one of the best players in the entire league, and had not yet reached the general prime age of a basketball career. Minnesota never made the playoffs with Love, and they knew they were not going to be contenders anytime soon, no matter how good Kevin Love was. So rebuilding was obviously on the table for them, and Golden State was a playoff squad that wanted to take the next step towards being a championship team. From these perspectives, a major trade made sense for both organizations. So trade rumors grew stronger and stronger that Kevin Love and Klay Thompson might be switching sides. I'm not gonna lie, one of my best friends at the time was a Warriors fan, and we were waiting anxiously for this trade to materialize. Because, believe it or not, at the time, it seemed like a completely lopsided trade in favor of Golden State. Fortunately, there was someone much smarter than both of us who was involved in the trade discussions, and that was the legendary icon Jerry West. At the time, West was working as a consultant for the Golden State Warriors, and he had a tremendous amount of faith in Klay Thompson's potential. In fact, he had so much belief in Klay's future that he was disgusted by the thought of trading him, even for a player as good as Kevin Love. So when the trade looked like it was about to go down, Jerry West threatened to quit his job with Golden State if the deal had went through. Thanks in large part to West's ultimatum, the trade never happened. Instead, Love was traded later that summer to the Cleveland Cavaliers for the rookie Andrew Wiggins. As a result of all of this, Klay immediately won a championship with the Warriors in 2015. Kevin Love won a championship with the Cavs in 2016, and then Klay would win an additional 3 championships after that, in 2017, 2018, and 2022. But what if Jerry West never stepped in? What if the trade actually went through? Well, without question, the person who suffers the most in this hypothetical situation is none other than Klay Thompson. If you ask me, Klay is typically a guy who thrives in a complementary role. as he is the ultimate 3-and-D player. In Minnesota, he would have been forced to be the leading man. Minnesota is statistically the most losing franchise in NBA history, and it's safe to assume that he wouldn't have been surrounded by much talent during his prime years. In this scenario, I truly believe Klay doesn't have a single championship ring, and he probably becomes an afterthought as simply a good player who got inflated stats on a bad team. But the real question mark is how it affects the legacy of Kevin Love. Draymond Green probably never gets the opportunities he got in Golden State, since Love is now the starting power forward. So who knows if Draymond even stays on the team in the long term. The Warriors almost certainly don't end up winning as many championships in this scenario. But at the same time, Steph Curry and Kevin Love would both be reaching the prime ages of their careers simultaneously. And I do believe Love would have been a better fit in Golden State's system than he was in Cleveland. With the Cavs, Love was relegated to a third option and became basically a glorified spot-up shooter. With the Warriors, Love would get to fully utilize his screening and three-point shooting in pick-and-pop situations, and his tremendous passing ability would stand out more as well in that free-flowing offense. Ultimately, I still think the Warriors would have found a way to win 1 or 2 championships, but not 4 like they did with Klay Thompson. Beyond just Klay and Love, this would also greatly affect the careers and legacies of both Steph Curry and LeBron James. But at that point, basketball history is reshaping so drastically that it's basically impossible to know how greatly things would have changed for them.
Ever got stuff going on continuously in your head, and no matter how hard you try, you just can't fall asleep? Well, that's pretty much me right now as I'm writing the script at 2 in the morning. My current predicament has got me thinking about basketball stuff from years past that still haunts me to this day. I'll forever wish these circumstances had played out differently. Obviously, these memories will be somewhat biased, considering the fact that I have to be emotionally involved in order for them to bother me after all these years. I definitely want to hear from you guys in the comments section. Which scenarios of basketball history do you wish would have gone differently after all these years? Now for my list, first off is the first round of the 2006 West playoffs and it's Game 6. You guys know this series, Lakers vs Suns, and at the end of Game 4, Kobe hit what was arguably the most iconic shot of his career, the game-winning buzzer beater that put the Lakers up 3-1 in the series. Even with a lead that big, I wasn't very comfortable. Phoenix was the far more talented second seed, and the Lakers were fortunate just to get a 3-1 lead in the first place. With their back against the wall, I knew Phoenix was going to win Game 5 in their own building, so in my mind, the series came down to Game 6 in Los Angeles. Both teams played like it was a must-win, and the result was an absolute classic. If you're like me and enjoy watching great games of years past, this is one you might want to check out, as it was an incredibly suspenseful back-and-forth battle throughout. This was Kobe's highest scoring playoff game of his career, and was certainly one of the best games of his career as well. He dropped 50 points in the game, and the degree of difficulty on some of his shots down the stretch was absolutely insane. After Kobe gets another difficult bucket, we're up by 3. All we need is one stop, but instead it goes sour very quickly. We can't contest anything very well, we can't get a loose ball, we can't box out and get a damn rebound, and this scrambling and amateur effort leads to Tim Thomas burying an open 3 to tie the game. All we had to do was secure the loose ball and the series is over. If we get that rebound, Kobe leads the 7th-seeded Lakers to upset the Phoenix Suns, and he does it with a 50-piece that will be remembered for the ages. Instead, in reality, the game goes to overtime, Phoenix wins Game 6, and then goes on to win Game 7. Obviously with this group, the Lakers aren't winning a championship even if they defeated the Suns in the first round. But there's a good chance they get to the Western Conference Finals, considering the second round would have been a matchup with the LA Clippers, a team that the Lakers had done well against that regular season. If Kobe took guys like Smush Parker, Kwame Brown, Chris Mim, and Luke Walton to the West Finals, then that would have been the stuff of legends. Maybe it seems insignificant in the grand scheme of things, but for me, this is just one moment that I can't quite get over. Second on my list is Michael Jordan's first season in Washington. Now before I get into this, let me first make a point. If someone was to say to you, man, wasn't Kevin Durant a disappointment in the 2019 NBA Finals? It's a shame that he couldn't get the team over the hump. you would probably be confused and remind that person that Kevin Durant got hurt and didn't finish the series because of it. As obvious as this logic sounds, people do this all the time with Michael Jordan's years in Washington. Michael Jordan's 2002 season was cut short because of a meniscus tear. He couldn't even finish the season, yet people blame him for missing the playoffs. I don't know if it's that people don't remember, they weren't paying attention, or if they simply just choose to ignore this fact. But it's really a bad look and appears ignorant when people use it as a criticism against him. Now here's the thing, Jordan and the Wizards were a lot better than people remember before he tore his meniscus. He had pretty solid numbers on the season and had led Washington to many crucial victories over Eastern Conference contenders, but he was getting even better as the season went on. In his last 10 games leading up to his injury, Jordan was averaging nearly 30 points, over 6 rebounds, and over 6 assists on 47% shooting. Individually, he was completely on fire leading up to the injury, but Washington was dominating as a team as well. They had a 26-21 record at the time of Jordan's injury, which put them easily in the playoff picture. But that record alone is severely lacking context. The Wizards' second best player was Richard Hamilton, who missed 5 weeks of their 26-21 stretch due to Hamilton's groin injury. After Hamilton healed and returned to the floor, the Wizards went on a dominant 15-1 streak while they had both Jordan and Hamilton on the floor. They were also easily the best team in the league defensively during that stretch, allowing only 86.3 points per game. So in a nutshell, Jordan was nearly 40 years old and was performing at an MVP level, and the Wizards were not only in the playoff hunt, but they were starting to look like one of the best teams in the entire Eastern Conference. And the only thing that ruined that momentum was Jordan's teammate Eton Thomas falling on his knee and tearing his meniscus. I wish this injury did not happen. It would have been amazing to see what noise Jordan and the Wizards could have made in the Eastern Conference playoffs. I really doubt they beat Jason Kidd's New Jersey Nets to get to the NBA Finals where they would have faced Shaq and Kobe's Lakers, but it is possible that they might have. Neither you or I know for sure, but I really wish I could have seen that season play out for MJ. Third and last on my list is the 1989 NBA Finals. Now I've explained this before, but let me explain it again real quick. I was not old enough to have seen this series, as I was only born in 1989. But it certainly feels like I did see it live, as my first experience watching this was as a kid in the mid-90s on these exact VHS tapes, and I had no idea who was going to win the series. The Lakers won the NBA championship in 1987 and 1988, which meant this finals appearance was a chance for Los Angeles to get their first three-peat in franchise history. If they were going to do it, they were going to have to defeat Isaiah Thomas and the Detroit Pistons. This would have given Magic Johnson 6 rings, and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar his 7th ring in his farewell season. I knew it was going to be a tough series, considering the Lakers had just gone to 7 games with the Pistons in the previous NBA Finals. Detroit won Game 1 at home, but the second game was a close dogfight, and the Lakers had a serious opportunity to win the game, which would have given them home court advantage for the rest of the series. But with only several minutes left in the third quarter, the Lakers were up by a bucket, and Detroit was on a fast break when Magic Johnson started hobbling. He had pulled his hamstring, and the pain was clearly seen on his face. Magic wanted to push through it, but eventually he had no choice and had to sit out the rest of the game. Magic wouldn't be the same for the rest of the series, and what could have been an epic three-peat and a perfect end to Abdul-Jabbar's career, instead all went up in smoke as the MVP of the league had no other choice but to go to the bench. Obviously, as a Lakers fan, I've been pretty spoiled throughout my life, but it's not like that completely nullifies all the painful near-miss memories. If there's one thing I learned from this video, it's that I really despise players with the last name Thomas. Let me know in the comments section what are some of your basketball experiences that you wish played out differently. A couple examples would be losing Kevin Garnett in 2009 if you're a Celtics fan, or even Derrick Rose's injury if you're a Bulls fan. Seeing that this is a very personal video for me, I look forward to hearing your personal experiences below.
Number 10. What if Chris Paul actually went to the Lakers? In December of 2011, the Lakers shocked the basketball world by making a trade for Chris Paul, which was going to pair him up with the still dominant and lethal Kobe Bryant to make the best backcourt in the entire NBA. Just hours after the deal was supposedly done, the trade was nixed by the NBA for, quote, basketball reasons. You see, the New Orleans Hornets and now New Orleans Pelicans are a unique NBA franchise in a sense that they are the only franchise in the league that is actually owned by the NBA itself and not just a single individual. Once Dell Demps, the GM of New Orleans, agreed to the deal, the other owners of the NBA threw a fit. According to then Commissioner of the NBA David Stern, Dell Demps was not authorized to make the deal, so Stern and the other owners voided the deal, and Paul was ultimately dealt to the Clippers instead. Would Chris and Kobe have actually won titles together? The Lakers still would have dealt Andrew Bynum for Dwight Howard. What would the team have looked like with Dwight and Paul playing the pick and roll while Kobe lurks on the perimeter? Does Kobe even tear his Achilles if he has Chris Paul to lean on at the point guard spot and doesn't have to play an insane amount of minutes just to earn a playoff spot? Number 9. What if Grant Hill and Penny Hardaway stayed healthy? In a 1996 interview, Michael Jordan was asked who he sees as the next Michael Jordan, the guy he would eventually pass the torch to when he inevitably retires. Michael said 2 players, Grant Hill and Penny Hardaway. Now, Penny was often compared to Magic Johnson more than Michael Jordan. Before Dwayne Wade and Kobe Bryant, Penny Hardaway was the feared wing player alongside of Shaquille O'Neal. He was a large point guard, standing 6 foot 7 inches. In only his second year in the league, he helped lead his team to 57 wins and a trip to the NBA Finals, while averaging 20.9 points per game, 7.2 assists per game, 4.4 rebounds, and 1.7 steals per game. Unfortunately, Penny had the curse of bad knees and had his first major knee surgery in 1997. Several surgeries and teams later, Penny was merely a shell of what he used to be in his Orlando days, and sadly, basketball fans never got to see his full potential. Grant Hill had a similar story. Before Kobe came onto the scene and was being called the next Michael Jordan, that title was often given to Grant Hill. In only his second year, he led the NBA in All-Star votes, edging the likes of Michael Jordan. Hill averaged 21.4 points, 9 rebounds, 7.3 assists, and 1.8 steals per game, while also leading the league in triple-doubles. And again, this was only his second season in the NBA. Grant had his first major ankle injury in the 1999-2000 season. After his first 6 seasons of his career, before his ankle injury, Hill had a total of 9,393 points, 3,417 rebounds, 2,720 assists. Oscar Robertson, Larry Bird, LeBron James are the only 3 players in league history to eclipse these numbers after their first 6 seasons in the league. As his career progressed, Grant continued to have reoccurring ankle injuries, and sadly, he never met his full potential either. Number 8. What if Vince Carter and Tracy McGrady stayed together? Vince Carter and Tracy McGrady started their careers together with the Raptors. They had a short tenure together in Toronto, though. At the time, Carter was already in the discussions for the best wing players in the entire league, while Tracy was seen as a quality 6-man with lots of potential. After getting bounced in the first round of the 2000 NBA playoffs, McGrady left the Raptors to head to his home state of Florida to join the Orlando Magic, signing a 6-year, $67.5 million contract. It was then that Tracy's career absolutely took off, winning the league's Most Improved Player award while averaging 26.8 points per game, 7.5 rebounds, and 4.6 assists per game. Only about a year ago, Tracy McGrady said he regretted leaving the Raptors for Orlando, wondering what the 2 dynamic players could have accomplished together. One man who believes they could have accomplished a lot was none other than 5-time champion Kobe Bryant, who said, "With McGrady and Carter and their numerous vets on the team, if they had stuck together, they could have won championships." That's an incredible statement coming from Kobe, especially when you consider that those years would have overlapped with the years Kobe and Shaq were winning their first 3 NBA championships. Sadly, we'll never know for sure what T-Mac and Vince could have accomplished together. Number 7. What if James Harden wasn't traded from OKC? This one is going to continue to climb the list of NBA what-ifs as time goes on, and Russell Westbrook, Kevin Durant, and James Harden continue to make history and further their legacies. It was October 2012, and one of the dumbest moves in NBA history. The Oklahoma City Thunder traded the 6th Man of the Year, James Harden, to the Houston Rockets after failing to reach a contract extension with Harden. Harden was seeking a 4-year, $60 million contract from OKC, but OKC was only willing to offer a $55.5 million deal. That's right, the Thunder decided not to commit to James Harden and instead trade him because they didn't want to pay him a little over an extra $1 million a year. They decided to break up a team that had taken a trip to the NBA Finals with their three main stars, who were 22 years old, 22 years old, and 21 years old. I honestly think it's safe to say that if OKC management hadn't shot themselves in the foot and traded Harden, we would likely be witnessing an OKC dynasty this very day. Number 6. What if Carmelo Anthony was drafted by the Pistons? The 2003 NBA draft was one of the greatest drafts in the league's history. The first 5 picks were LeBron James, Darko Milicic, Carmelo Anthony, Chris Bosh, and Dwayne Wade. Talk about the case of one of these things is not like the others. LeBron was a shoe-in number 1 pick for the Cleveland Cavaliers heading into this draft. Carmelo Anthony was seen by many analysts and experts as the second best player in the draft. But the second pick belonged to the already contending Detroit Pistons, who had several wing players already and had more of a need for a big man. You know the rest. The Detroit Pistons selected the Serbian bust Darko Milicic, and the following 3 picks were future NBA Hall of Famers. The part that makes this whole thing really interesting is that despite the fact that the Pistons passed on Carmelo and selected Darko Milicic, the bust, they still went on to win the NBA championship that season. Now imagine if they had selected Carmelo. Not only is Carmelo one of the best scorers this league has ever seen, but now he is an NBA champion. How would the legacy and perception of Carmelo change if you add a ring or a few to his resume? How dominant would the Pistons have been if you had lined him up with Ben Wallace, Chauncey Billups, and Richard Hamilton? Number 5. What if Michael Jordan was drafted by the Blazers? Coming in at the number 5 spot is the biggest draft mistake of all time. At the 1984 draft, the Houston Rockets started the draft by selecting Hakeem Olajuwon. No, that was not the mistake. Even though Houston passed on selecting Jordan, it's hard to criticize a team when they selected one of the greatest centers of all time and won 2 championships with the guy. No, the mistake was the very next pick, when the Blazers selected Kentucky big man Sam Bowie at number 2. Michael Jordan was the next pick, selected 3rd by the Chicago Bulls. The Trailblazers passed on Jordan since they were already covered at shooting guard with their star Clyde Drexler. Bowie's career was ruined by injuries to his legs and feet and ended up being one of the biggest busts the game has ever seen. Michael Jordan simply went on to be the consensus greatest player ever. This was yet another prime example of why you should draft the best player available and not based on your team needs. There really isn't too much else that needs to be said about this what if. If Jordan had been drafted by the Blazers, the duo of Drexler and Jordan in the Western Conference would have likely ruined title runs for the Los Angeles Lakers and would have completely changed basketball history as we know it. Number 4. What if Michael Jordan never retired to play baseball? In the 1993 season, Jordan was on top of the basketball world, having just won his 3rd straight NBA championship, and at 30 years old, in the prime of his career, Michael Jordan shocked the world by announcing his retirement from the NBA. Michael then went on to play his first love, baseball, having a lackluster career in the minor leagues before eventually returning to the Chicago Bulls with only 17 games left in the 1995 regular season.
Many believed Jordan appeared to be rusty when the Bulls were later eliminated in the second round of the playoffs by Shaquille O'Neal and Penny Hardaway of the Orlando Magic. Later in June of 1995, the Houston Rockets defeated the Magic to win their 2nd straight NBA championship. But what if Michael never left the Bulls in '93? In 1994, the year Jordan missed completely, the Bulls were able to push the Knicks to a Game 7 in the second round without Jordan. It's not far-fetched to think the Bulls would have likely been good enough to win that championship in 1994 had Jordan still been with them. And what about 1995? With Jordan in tip-top basketball shape and no signs of rust, maybe that Orlando series might have gone differently and the Bulls go on to win that championship as well. It's possible that if Jordan never left the game, the Bulls might have gone on to win an incredible 8 straight championships. We'll never know for sure. Instead, Hakeem Olajuwon of the Houston Rockets has the 2 championships he so greatly deserves in the center of the Jordan era. Number 3. What if Derrick Rose never got injured? Coming in at the 3rd spot of this list is one of the most tragic injury stories in NBA history. In the 2011 NBA season, Derrick Rose was at the center of the basketball spotlight, winning the NBA Most Valuable Player award and being the youngest player to ever do it at just 22 years old. He averaged 25 points per game, 7.7 assists per game, and 4.1 rebounds per game, and the Chicago Bulls won 62 games, finishing with the best record in the Eastern Conference that season. The future looked bright for young Derrick, who looks as if he was destined to be one of the all-time greats and a rival to LeBron James in the Eastern Conference for years to come. For those of you who weren't closely watching at that time, Derrick Rose had Russell Westbrook-type explosiveness combined with John Wall speed, and man, could he finish at the rim. It was just 1 year later, in Game 1 of the first round of the NBA playoffs, Derrick attacked the basket, made a hop-step move that we had seen him make so many times in his young career, and he tore his ACL. His career was changed forever, and he has never since been able to replicate his MVP form that we saw in his early years of his career. Number 2. What if Shaq and Kobe stayed together? This one probably comes as no surprise to any of you. Shaq and Kobe, one of the most dominant duos the league has ever seen. Also 2 of the biggest alpha males the league has ever seen. Back when Shaq and Kobe split ways, a popular argument was who was to blame for their split, Shaq or Kobe. But now in hindsight, I think it's pretty clear to see that in reality, it was both. Both players had an incredible ego that was through the roof. Is it Shaq's team? Is it Kobe's team? These narratives mattered greatly to the two. Even the stars' personalities were extremely different. Kobe was this serious, hard-working, closed-off lone wolf. Shaq, on the other hand, was a fun, playful leader who famously showed up to training camp overweight in 2004, which also famously infuriated Kobe Bryant. It all came crashing down at the end of the 2004 season. The Lakers were considered overwhelming favorites over the Detroit Pistons in the NBA Finals, but the Lakers were upset 4-1. With Kobe's free agency underway that offseason, Lakers management had a decision to make: keep Kobe or Shaq. They committed to the younger star and signed Kobe to a massive contract while trading Shaquille O'Neal to the Miami Heat. Both players continued to be elite years afterwards. Shaq won a championship with Dwayne Wade in Miami, and Kobe won 2 more in Los Angeles. But what could the two have done if they had put their differences aside and stayed together? How many more championships would they have won? After all, Kobe's prime years of his career were with Kwame Brown on his team. How different would that have been if that was Shaq? And number 1, what if Len Bias lived? To me, this story is definitely the greatest what if in NBA history. Partially because of the mystery of it, but also because of the level of impact it could have had on the NBA as we know it. Len Bias was a 6'9" forward from the University of Maryland who had incredible athletic abilities along with a smooth jump shot. Len Bias was a college star. He had epic battles with Michael Jordan while he was in North Carolina and was seen as a player of Michael Jordan's caliber. Meanwhile, in the NBA, Magic Johnson's Lakers and Larry Bird's Celtics were the premier teams in the league. The Celtics went on to win the 1986 NBA championships with their stars Larry Bird, Kevin McHale, and Robert Parrish. That 86 Celtics team is still considered one of the greatest teams in NBA history. Fast forward to the NBA draft, and thanks to a trade a couple years earlier with the Seattle Supersonics, the Boston Celtics owned the 2nd overall pick in the draft the same year they won the NBA championship. Cleveland had the first pick and needed a big man, so they selected future All-Star center Brad Daugherty. With their 2nd pick, the Boston Celtics selected their exciting forward of the future, Len Bias. Len, the man who many were saying was going to rival Michael Jordan for years to come, was now joining Larry Bird and the already all-time great Boston Celtics squad. But then, less than 48 hours later, while he was in his college dorm room celebrating with his friends, Len Bias had a seizure and collapsed. Soon after medical attention arrived, Bias was pronounced dead at 22 years old. It was simply a cocaine overdose, making Len Bias the poster child of the NBA's terrible cocaine issues in the 1980s. This tragedy left the school, his family, and the Celtics organization devastated, and the rest was history. So what if? What if the man who was compared to Michael Jordan would have lived and joined an already stacked Celtics team? Do Magic Johnson and the Lakers win their championships in 87 and 88? Do the Pistons win their championships in 89 and 90? When Bias reached the prime of his career, is he battling Jordan in the 90s and preventing MJ from winning his famous 6 titles? Would Michael Jordan be considered the greatest of all time if he had less titles? How would that have influenced Kobe, LeBron, and other greats who grew up idolizing Jordan? As you're watching this video, would you be wearing Biases right now instead of Jordans? This one what if could have changed everything.
Let me take you back in time. It's October 6th, 1993, and the Chicago Bulls are currently the defending NBA champions, just recently winning their 3rd straight title, making themselves the first team to three-peat since Bill Russell's Celtics in the 1980s. Michael Jordan seemed as if he was at the height of his powers, coming off of an NBA Finals series where he just averaged 41 points per game. He was the most famous sports athlete in the entire world. But unfortunately, after the tragic passing of his father, James Jordan, just a few months earlier, Michael Jordan shook the basketball world by abruptly announcing his retirement, which was effective immediately. Obviously, this was overwhelmingly stunning news to the media, to the league office, and to basketball fans around the world. But after the dust settled, one of the biggest questions that remained was how this would affect the Chicago Bulls' playoff chances moving forward. The Bulls' 28-year-old superstar, Scottie Pippen, was now being thrust into a position that he had never been in before in his basketball career, and that was the role of a leader and as the best player on a professional team. As unfair as the burden of responsibility was, it was now Scottie Pippen's job to fill the shoes that were left empty by the legendary Michael Jordan. But he would be doing it with some extra help. And that offseason, the Bulls made several major acquisitions. One of those was the sharpshooting guard Steve Kerr, and the other was the versatile 6'10 small forward Tony Kukoc. The Bulls were coming off of a year where they had finished the regular season with a 57-25 record under the leadership of Michael Jordan. With MJ now out of the picture and only several new role players to replace him, the Bulls seemed to be a wild card heading into the 1993-94 regular season. Adjusting to a Jordan-less offense would be no easy task for Chicago, and because of this, the regular season got off to quite the rough start. By late November, it was appearing as if it was going to be a disastrous lottery season, as the Bulls were sitting 3 games below 500 in the midst of losing 6 out of their last 7 games. But it was right at this point that things finally started to click for Chicago, and first and foremost, finding his groove was the team's new leader, Scottie Pippen. Although he didn't become a league-leading scorer like some expected after the departure of Jordan, he did assert himself as a more well-rounded team leader, as he did a little bit of everything for Chicago. Over the course of the season, Scottie led his team in points, assists, and steals, while being second in rebounds and blocked shots. With Pippen operating as the point forward in Phil Jackson's triangle offense, the Bulls started executing beautifully on a nightly basis, quickly establishing themselves as a contender in the Eastern Conference. At the end of the regular season, they had a 55-27 record, which was good enough for the 3rd seed in a strong Eastern Conference. Scottie Pippen finished that season 3rd overall in the league MVP race, and at this point, many fans in the Windy City were starting to imagine a scenario that they once thought was impossible. The Bulls might just win their 4th straight championship even without Michael Jordan on the roster. As early May was approaching, Michael Jordan was figuring out his place on the baseball diamond, while his former team, the Chicago Bulls, were preparing for their postseason run. Their first round matchup was against the 6th-seeded Cleveland Cavaliers. This was a Cavs team that they had met in the playoffs in the previous 2 seasons, and the Bulls won on both occasions. But with a talented star point guard at the helm for the Cavaliers by the name of Mark Price, they thought that this might finally be their opportunity to eliminate the Chicago Bulls out of the playoffs. But they couldn't have been more wrong. Scottie Pippen had a monster series, averaging 25 points, 10 rebounds, 4 assists, and 3 steals. And as a result, Chicago swept the Cavs in just 3 games. For years, it was Michael Jordan who was known as the Cavalier Killer, as he was torching Cleveland on both ends of the court and hitting game winners time and time again. But now, the Bulls had just convincingly swept the Cavs without MJ. It goes without saying, the team's confidence was now at an all-time high. But waiting before them in the Eastern Conference semifinals was their greatest test yet. It was their rivals, the physically punishing New York Knicks. In the 2 years prior with MJ, the Bulls had had long playoff battles with the Knicks that ended in 6 and 7 games. Historically, they had always been one of the toughest teams for Chicago to get through, so they believed if they were able to win this series, they would absolutely have what it takes to win the championship. What proceeded was an absolute dogfight. As expected, the series opened up being extremely physical and defensively minded, and after the first 2 games in New York, the Knicks had a 2-0 series lead. There was several famous, iconic plays that occurred in this series, and the first came in Game 3. To put it simply, this contest was absolutely wild, as a crazy brawl broke out that was started between the Knicks' Derek Harper and the Bulls' JoJo English. But despite the altercation clearing the benches and spilling over into the first row of the fans, this was still only an appetizer for the drama that was ahead. With less than 10 seconds left in the game, the Bulls had the ball and were up by 2 points, with the shot clock winding down. Entrusted to take this shot was the Chicago leading star, Scottie Pippen. But with a somewhat limited bag offensively, he was unable to create a good look and didn't get off a shot, as the shot clock expired with the ball in his hands. On the other end of the court, Patrick Ewing hit a running hook shot to tie the game at 102. Now the ball was going back to Chicago with 1.8 seconds left on the clock. A frustrated Scottie was looking for an opportunity to redeem himself with another attempt at a game-icing basket. The thing is, the Bulls head coach Phil Jackson had something else in mind. He decided to set up a play where the inbounds pass would go to Tony Kukoc, who had made several game winners throughout the regular season. Scottie was irate at Phil's decision, and in a protest, he refused to go back into the game altogether. Regardless, Kukoc went on to take the inbounds pass and swished the game-winning jumper, proving the fact that Jackson did know what he was doing. Despite the victory, the post-game locker room for the Bulls was described as incredibly tense and very somber. The Bulls center, Bill Cartwright, gave an emotional speech where he called out Scottie for quitting on the team. Now here's the thing, when you see this in the documentaries, and when you see the mainstream media break down this series, usually they make it seem like the series ended then and there, with Scottie's selfishness ultimately being the team's downfall. But that wasn't in fact the case, as Pippen and Chicago bounced back in a major way. The next game in the series was a must-win for Chicago, and Scottie came through mightily as he dropped 25 points, 8 rebounds, and 6 assists on 10 of 21 shooting. Thanks to this clutch performance, the Bulls won the game and tied up the series at 2 games apiece. The series was now returning to New York for a pivotal 5th game, and what ensued was once again a classic close battle. With just over 7 seconds left in the 4th quarter, the Bulls were up by 1 point, and the Knicks had the ball as they were inbounding the pass with a chance to take the lead. What happened then is simply one of the most controversial foul calls in NBA history, which Chicago fans referred to as their phantom foul. The elite perimeter shooter Hubert Davis catches the ball at the top of the key with a clean look at the basket, but Scottie Pippen closed ground quickly and contested the shot, and NBA referee Hugh Hollins blew the whistle right as the shot was being missed. When you look at the instant replay, you can see that Davis was trying to sell the contact before Pippen had reached him. And even then, it's hard to tell whether or not Pippen actually made any contact with him whatsoever. If the referee doesn't blow that whistle, then the Bulls win the game and take a commanding 3-2 series lead back to Chicago. And in Chicago for Game 6, the Bulls went on to dominate the Knicks, which included one of the greatest dunks in NBA history, Pippen's disrespectful slam on Patrick Ewing. But unfortunately, that's only a hypothetical, because the ref did blow that whistle, and Hubert Davis went on to hit 2 free throws to win the game for New York. Ultimately, the Knicks went on to win the series in the 7th game at home. But personally, I always felt like that game never should have happened in the first place. Yes, Pippen had that awful, selfish moment in that series, but sadly, he never got that true opportunity to redeem himself with a potential NBA Finals run. Because of this massive, history-shaping call by Hugh Hollins, this season for Scottie Pippen and the Chicago Bulls will remain as one of the biggest what-ifs in franchise history.
Throughout the decades, there have been many disappointing NBA franchises. Several organizations have a reputation of consistent losing. But in order to take the title of the most cursed franchise in NBA history, a team has to have more than just consistent failure. It needs to have the expectations and potential set to astronomically high levels just to end up falling tremendously short. One specific organization fits that description to a T: the Portland Trail Blazers. Yes, Portland has one lone championship banner hanging up in the rafters, but that title goes all the way back to the year 1977, and considering the opportunities they've had, this is a franchise that should have many Larry O'Brien trophies, not just one. In order to understand just how far the franchise fell from its potential, we have to take it all the way back to the team's inception. The Portland Trail Blazers started as an NBA expansion team in the 1970-71 season. Like most expansion teams, the Blazers struggled out of the gates, as they missed the playoffs in their first 6 seasons of existence. Fortunately, they had one of the all-time great centers by the name of Bill Walton. With Walton at the helm, the Blazers achieved the unexpected and won the NBA championship in the 1977 season. The Blazers started the following season looking as if they were ready to repeat, and through the first 60 games, they had a 50-10 record. At this point, many people in basketball circles were predicting this team to be an NBA dynasty. Unfortunately, this is where everything began to go downhill. Walton suffered a broken left ankle that caused him to miss the remainder of the season. This certainly wasn't anything out of the ordinary for Walton, as the guy has an injury history long enough to make even Anthony Davis blush. The thing is, Walton suffered so many reoccurring injuries that he began blaming the Blazers medical team and demanded that the organization trade him. Having recently won the championship, Portland's management was hesitant to trade their superstar big man, so in a protest, Walton sat out the entirety of the 78-79 season. By that point, Walton was now a free agent and signed with the San Diego Clippers. If there was anyone who put a curse on the Portland franchise, it was probably Bill Walton on his way out the door, as the Blazers have struggled to replicate their success ever since. After many years of missing the playoffs or early postseason exits, the Blazers found themselves in the 1984 draft with the 2nd overall pick. The incredible Hakeem Olajuwon had just been taken with the first pick by the Houston Rockets. Now remaining on the board was the hyped 7'1" prospect out of Kentucky, Sam Bowie, and then some shooting guard named Michael Jordan. With Portland on the clock, management considered the fact that they already had a young phenom by the name of Clyde Drexler at the shooting guard position. So instead of taking Jordan, they decided to select the big man Bowie in order to fill their lacking center position. This is yet another great example of why you should draft players based on their talent and not by your position needs. Bowie went on to be a bust, as he not only struggled with injuries, but he also failed to live up to the production levels that scouts expected. Meanwhile, Michael Jordan simply went on to be the consensus greatest player of all time. This was a mistake that still haunts Portland to this very day, but unfortunately, this wasn't the last time that they would make this kind of mistake. More on that in a bit. With an extremely talented roster, led by all-stars like Clyde Drexler and Terry Porter, the Blazers made it to the NBA Finals twice, in 1990 and in 1992. Unfortunately, they ran into two juggernauts. They were defeated by Isaiah Thomas and the Detroit Pistons in 1990, and then defeated by Michael Jordan and the Chicago Bulls in 1992. From this point on, the Blazers would consistently make the playoffs, but were never really considered again as true title contenders until around the year 2000. Led by players like Scottie Pippen, Rasheed Wallace, Arvydas Sabonis, and Damon Stoudemire, the 99-2000 Blazers won 59 regular season games and had a strong advantage late into the postseason. In Game 7 of the Western Conference Finals against the Los Angeles Lakers, Portland had a 13-point lead at the end of the third quarter, and momentum was clearly on their side. In the fourth quarter, things took a dramatic turn for the worse. Many people think the refereeing in this game was questionable, or even rigged, as the NBA may have had an agenda to get the Lakers to the finals. That may or may not have been the case. But what was even more questionable than the refs' motives was the Blazers' ability to handle the pressure, as they went completely scoreless for an 8-minute stretch in that fourth quarter, including 13 straight missed field goal attempts. Needless to say, the Blazers choked away the game as the Lakers went on to win the NBA championship. Despite having a deep and talented roster worthy of a championship, the early 2000s Blazers just couldn't stop stumbling over their own feet, as the team was deeply affected by their off-the-court issues, which earned them the nickname the Jailblazers. Along with that, they lacked maturity late in games, as players like Rasheed Wallace were consistently receiving technical fouls at a record rate. Based on their depth and their talent, this squad should have won a title. But instead, by the mid-2000s, the franchise was completely in rebuild mode. They appeared as if they were finally ready to turn their misfortunes around, as they had the first overall pick of the 2007 NBA Draft. History would repeat itself though, as Portland once again had their eyes set on a 7-foot big man, this time a player by the name of Greg Oden. They took Oden with the first pick, and the player they passed up to do so was the incredible scoring assassin Kevin Durant. Due to his various injuries, Oden would only play 105 regular season games in his very short basketball career, and he had completely retired from the NBA by only the age of 26. Meanwhile, Kevin Durant would go on to be a 2-time NBA champion, a 2-time Finals MVP, an MVP, and is now widely recognized as one of the greatest players of all time. It was just like Sam Bowie and Michael Jordan all over again. Even though they botched yet another golden opportunity in the draft, it didn't yet appear as if all hope was lost, as the Blazers still had one of the most lethal weapons in the league, the young shooting guard Brandon Roy. At his peak, Kobe Bryant referred to Roy as the toughest player to guard in the entire Western Conference. But just like every other bright spot in Blazers history, this one didn't last very long either. After making 3 straight All-Star teams, Roy's knees had deteriorated to such an extreme extent that he no longer had any cartilage between the bones. By the time he was 26 years old, he had played his final game with the Portland Trail Blazers. A couple years later, Portland would select the superstar point guard Damian Lillard with the 6th pick of the 2012 draft. But since then, they haven't been able to surround him with the right supporting cast in order to be a championship contender. Basically, ever since they've acquired Lillard, they've been the standard of mediocrity, and that doesn't appear to be changing anytime soon. Here's the thing. As I mentioned earlier in this video, the Blazers are the most cursed franchise in the league, not necessarily because of how bad they are, but because of how promising they appear to be time and time again, just to end up leaving their fan base incredibly disappointed. And here's a stat that perfectly sums that up. From 1983 to 2003, the Blazers went to the playoffs for an impressive 21 consecutive seasons, and yet never won a single championship during that stretch. That's the longest streak of playoff berths without a championship in NBA history. To put that in perspective, the Spurs had a streak of 22 seasons where they made the playoffs and they won 5 championships in that stretch. The Celtics had a streak of 19 seasons and won 11 championships, and the Lakers had a streak of 17 seasons and won 5 championships. That pretty much sums up the Portland Trail Blazers as an organization. Typically, they're not good enough to win championships, but they're also consistently average, which means they're rarely in the draft lottery, which almost completely ruins their chances to acquire franchise players. And even then, when they are in the draft lottery, the universe still finds a way to screw it up for them, just like it did in these instances. All in all, the Blazers should have numerous championship banners in the rafters. They should have the jerseys hung of two of the greatest players of all time, and they should have several more Hall of Famers in their history. But unfortunately, injuries repeatedly destroyed those careers. So what do you guys think? Are the Blazers the most cursed franchise in NBA history? Or do you think there's another who's more deserving of that title?
As most basketball fans already know, Tracy McGrady was simply one of the most talented players to ever play the game. As Kobe Bryant once described him, he was a player who had all the skills and athleticism, but in a 6'9" frame. At his peak, he was averaging as high as 32 points per game, and he's famously known for his iconic comeback over the San Antonio Spurs, where he scored 13 points in only 35 seconds. As talented as McGrady was, his potential reached even higher. But unfortunately, his chronic back injuries disrupted his career and stunted his progression, making him one of the greatest what-ifs of basketball history. With that being said, we still got to witness McGrady perform at an elite level for roughly 7 seasons straight, and within that window, many stories and legacy-defining moments took place that much of the basketball community have since forgotten. Today, we're tackling the story of Tracy McGrady's career and evaluating the events that took place when his legacy was on the line. When McGrady entered the league, he was an 18-year-old kid straight out of high school who would take time to blossom into the superstar we know. T-Mac was only operating as a role player in his time in Toronto, while his cousin Vince Carter was operating as the franchise player and the talk of the town. In his last season as a member of the Raptors, McGrady made the NBA playoffs but was swept out of the first round in 3 games by the New York Knicks. Unfortunately, this early playoff exit would begin to become a theme of his career, a theme that would start to build a narrative about him as a player and about his legacy. In the summer of 2000, McGrady signed with the Orlando Magic, putting him in a position where he was now able to shine as the primary superstar of a team. McGrady was now averaging around 27 points per game and was proving himself to be one of the best perimeter players in the entire league. Orlando finished as a 7th seed heading into the playoffs, where they were matched up with a far more talented Milwaukee Bucks squad. It's also worth mentioning that Tracy's sidekick Grant Hill was out for the playoffs with yet another significant injury, which meant that T-Mac had to carry the team almost exclusively offensively. He put up ridiculously monstrous all-around numbers throughout the series, but ultimately it wasn't anywhere close to enough as the stacked Bucks closed out the Magic in 4 games. The following season was more of the same, as Grant Hill once again missed the entirety of the playoffs, while Tracy had to carry an Orlando squad that was pretty devoid of talent. This time, the Magic were eliminated in 4 games by the Charlotte Hornets, and McGrady once again put up insanely monstrous numbers. He consistently wasn't getting the help he needed, and as a result, this ended up being the 3rd straight season that T-Mac had been eliminated out of the first round of the playoffs. But it was in the next season where his reputation started to take some major hits. From an individual standpoint, McGrady's 02-03 season was likely the best of his career, as he put up his best regular season numbers yet. The thing is, Tracy was still missing a second star, as Grant Hill only played 29 games, which were all in the first half of the season. Orlando finished with a 42-40 record, which was good enough for only the 8th seed in the Eastern Conference and resulted in a matchup with the consistently contending Detroit Pistons. McGrady and the Magic were obviously massive underdogs in this series, and stunningly, they roared out of the gates and managed to get a 3-1 series lead over Detroit. Up to this point, Tracy looked like he was having one of the greatest playoff series in NBA history, as he dominated his way to these absurdly high and efficient numbers against arguably the best defensive team of that era. Unfortunately, the season wasn't yet over at that point, but that didn't stop McGrady from acting like it. In a controversial post-game interview, McGrady confidently stated, "It feels good to get into the second round," even though his Magic were only up 3-1. It was a classic example of pride coming before the fall, as the Pistons went on to crush the Magic in the next 3 games straight, winning by an average of 20.3 points. The series was a tale of two McGrady's, as his last 3 games looked nothing like his first 4, as he was contained to extremely inefficient numbers by Detroit. Not only did McGrady's post-game comment age like milk, but it also started to appear like some self-induced curse, as he once again failed to get out of the first round, and the narrative was now firmly established that he was a superstar that just couldn't advance in the playoffs. What's probably worse than getting eliminated in the first round is not making the playoffs at all, which is what happened in the 03-04 season, as Orlando finished with the worst record in the Eastern Conference despite McGrady winning his second straight scoring title. At this point, Orlando's management had finally accepted the fact that they were a franchise that needed a rebuild, and traded McGrady to the Houston Rockets. T-Mac expressed his excitement to play with the new star big man Yao Ming. As a legitimate superstar duo, McGrady and Yao led the Rockets to a 51-31 record, and it appeared that McGrady might finally be in a solid position to advance beyond the first round. They were facing a solid Dallas Mavericks team whose Dirk Nowitzki was just reaching the prime of his career. T-Mac started off solid, as did his Rockets, as they stormed out to a 2-0 lead in the series. The Mavericks clawed their way back into it, and the series was heading to a deciding 7th game in Dallas. Although T-Mac had played incredible throughout the majority of the series and had put up his usual strong postseason numbers, he picked the wrong time and place to come out cold, as Tracy missed his first 7 shots of the 7th game. Houston could never find their groove, and the Mavericks completely demolished McGrady and the Rockets, winning the deciding game by a whopping 40 points. At this point in history, many basketball fans, including myself, were confused as to what to make of Tracy McGrady. On one hand, he appeared to be one of the greatest talents that the game of basketball had ever seen, and consistently produced tremendous postseason numbers. But on the other hand, for one reason or another, he just couldn't get past the first round of the playoffs, as he was now 0-5 in his first round appearances. In the following season, Houston was hit with a slew of injuries, including the first major one to Tracy McGrady, as it was the beginning of his devastating back injuries that would ultimately cut his career short. Due to this, the 05-06 Rockets missed the playoffs entirely, finishing with only a 34-48 record. The Rockets franchise was able to bounce back in the 06-07 season, as Yao Ming had a breakout year, asserting himself as Houston's #1 scoring option. T-Mac was still a legitimate weapon, but with his back issues still lingering, he saw a significant drop in his regular season production. With that being said, together, Yao and McGrady led the Rockets to a 52-30 record, good enough for the 5th seed in the West playoffs. Prior to the start of their first round series with Utah, McGrady was being interviewed by ESPN's own Stephen A. Smith. And in the interview, Stephen A. didn't waste any time acknowledging the elephant in the room, T-Mac's inability to lead his team past the first round up until this point. A confident yet agitated McGrady responded with this.
It's on me. If we don't get out of the first round, it's on me. Wait a minute. If we don't get out of the first round this year, it's on me.
It's pretty incredible to see such a bold statement from a superstar like McGrady. It's not often that athletes bet on themselves with such ownership and such a sense of responsibility. The pressure was immense, and almost everyone in the basketball world was waiting to see how it unfolded. Through the first 6 games, McGrady was getting his numbers, but he was doing it at a high volume of shots, as he wasn't shooting the ball very efficiently at all. Fortunately, he was actually getting help from a solid supporting cast, and as a result, the series was tied at 3 games apiece heading into the 7th and deciding game. The pressure for him had never been more intense than it was in this game, and under these extreme circumstances, McGrady produced, finishing Game 7 with 29 points, 13 assists, 5 rebounds, and 3 blocks on 48% shooting. Unfortunately, it still wasn't enough, as Utah Stars had individual performances for the ages. After this close defeat, McGrady had been eliminated from the first round in all 6 appearances of his career. A clearly emotional McGrady was trying hard to keep his composure in the press conference afterwards. But as soon as the questions started to come, T-Mac simply left without answering the question, saying emotionally, This was beyond devastating. Not only was it yet another first round defeat, but McGrady's team had a 2-game series lead in 2003, 2005, and 2007, and went on to lose each and every series. The following year, Houston would get a rematch with the Utah Jazz in the first round of the playoffs. But tragically, Yao Ming's season was shut down 2 months before the playoffs began due to a stress fracture in his left foot. This meant that a shorthanded McGrady had to do his best to carry the offense for the Rockets. But ultimately, despite a pretty solid series performance, McGrady was eliminated for the 7th time from the first round as the Jazz comfortably closed it out in 6 games. From this point on, Tracy's career wouldn't be about his early playoff exits, but rather about his early regular season exits due to his severe back injuries. Over the next 4 seasons, McGrady's game declined to a role player's level of contribution, and he missed 139 regular season games, and wouldn't get another true taste of playoff basketball. Eventually, in 2013, he was signed by the San Antonio Spurs and was activated just in time for the playoffs. He only saw roughly 25 total garbage time minutes in that postseason, and never scored a single point as he was only a shell of what he once was. But technically, it did at least allow him to play beyond the first round of the playoffs, since the Spurs went all the way to the NBA Finals that season before eventually being eliminated in 7 games by the Big Three's Miami Heat. With that, he had played his final minutes of NBA basketball in only his early 30s. So as you can see, T-Mac had one of the most tragic and confusing legacies that the game has ever seen. Although legends like Kobe Bryant have praised him for being the most difficult player he's ever had to guard, T-Mac is also the star who couldn't advance in the playoffs no matter how many opportunities he was presented with. So what do you guys think? Was McGrady unable to advance in the playoffs simply because of all of the bad circumstances, like injuries and lacking supporting casts, or was there something about him as a player that kept him from getting it done? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. Thanks.
What if the Rockets made the trade? The 1984 NBA draft class is famously known as one of the greatest draft classes of all time. Most of us hardcore basketball fans know the draft order off the top of our heads. Hakeem Olajuwon to the Rockets, then Sam Bowie to the Blazers, and then Michael Jordan to the Chicago Bulls. What many people don't realize was that there was nearly a blockbuster trade that night that would have drastically changed the course of basketball history. You see, the Houston Rockets had the first overall pick, and at the time, Hakeem Olajuwon appeared to be the clear choice to be taken first. The thing is, the Rockets already had a star playing at center, which was the future Hall of Famer, Ralph Sampson, who had just come off his rookie season where he averaged 21 points and 11 rebounds. Other teams around the league also knew that the Rockets were in a bit of a dilemma, so the Portland Trail Blazers made an offer of their second overall pick and their young star in Clyde Drexler in return for Ralph Sampson. Drexler had shown promise at this young stage of his career, but he was still pretty unproven, so the trade Portland offered looked pretty appealing at the time, but in hindsight, we can now see how horrible it would have been for their team. If the Rockets had accepted the offer, they would have had Clyde Drexler and the first and second overall pick, which they almost certainly would have used to take Hakeem Olajuwon and Michael Jordan, forming what would have been on paper the strongest big three in NBA history. Obviously, there's the questions of fit and on-court chemistry, but at a certain point, a team has so much talent that even if they underperform by their standards, they're still likely dominating the league. Olajuwon and Jordan were both elite players the second they set foot on the court, and they were both elite until about 1998. With the greatest player of all time, one of the greatest centers of all time, and arguably a top 5 shooting guard of all time, what is the realistic projection for the success of this team? At least 10 championships? It sounds bold, but at the same time, completely reasonable. This would have dramatically changed the Lakers and Celtics rivalry of the 80s, because now, the Rockets are likely keeping the Lakers from making the NBA Finals in the mid to late 80s. I could go on and on about the ways this would have reshaped the league for years to come, but ultimately, the trade never went down, because although they wrestled with the offer, the Rockets instead played it safe, kept Sampson, and went with the Twin Tower approach by selecting Olajuwon. Although Hakeem would eventually lead Houston to win 2 championships, given what they could have had if they had accepted the offer, this non-trade was likely the greatest regret of the franchise's history. What if Bill Walton never got hurt? When I say the greatest centers of all time, what are some names that come to mind? Russell, Chamberlain, Shaq, Kareem, Robinson, Hakeem, Moses? All amazing players. But if it had not been for injuries, I can confidently say that this man would have been in that group. The 6'11" Bill Walton. Bill was drafted with the first overall pick in the 1974 NBA draft by the Portland Trail Blazers. He came into the league ready to have an immediate impact, as he was one of the most skilled and talented big men the game had ever seen. His offensive and defensive IQ was off the charts. He always played with hustle and heart, his footwork was pristine, his hook shot was lethal, he had incredible court vision and passing skills for a big man, his rebounding was among the best, and he was one of the greatest rim protectors. The dude was a beast of a basketball player, but unfortunately his body was incredibly brittle. And when I say brittle, I mean he was basically the GOAT of being brittle. In his first 2 years in the NBA, he had chronic foot injuries, dislocating 2 toes, breaking 1 toe in a separate off-the-court incident, he broke his left wrist twice, and dislocated 2 fingers. Again, this all happened in his first 2 seasons. In the playoffs of his 4th season, Bill broke his left ankle, and this would be the injury that ruined the trajectory of his impressive career. Despite all of those injuries, before he even turned 26 years old, he led the league 1 year in rebounds, he led the league 1 season in blocks, he made 2 all-defense teams, he made 2 all-star teams, he was an NBA champion, he was the finals MVP, and he was the 1978 league MVP. How in the world do you accumulate all of these injuries as if you're the glass bones guy from SpongeBob, yet you still manage to achieve all of these accolades? If that doesn't tell you how good Bill Walton was, then nothing will. Unfortunately, after his Portland days were done, he would continue to have severe injuries throughout his career. And although he would win another championship as a legitimate 6th man for the '86 Celtics, his days of being a superstar force in the paint were long behind him. One can only imagine how good he would have been if he had been blessed with a healthy career. What if the malice at the palace never happened? In November of 2004, the NBA had one of its ugliest nights in its history, known famously as the Malice at the Palace. It started with a hard foul and a shove between Ben Wallace and Ron Artest. But once the drink was thrown in Artest's direction, absolute chaos broke out with players and fans punching each other. This was an intense black eye to the reputation of the NBA, so the league office was determined to make sure that a night like this would never happen again. If you look at what started the whole Palace brawl, it stemmed from a physical rivalry between 2 elite teams. That game in particularly had many chippy moments and physical altercations leading up to the hard foul and the drink being thrown. So as a response to the escalated violence, the league began cracking down much quicker on trash talking, hard fouls, and emotional outbursts. Referees became much quicker to hand out technical fouls as a way to diffuse and gain control of a situation. Naturally, over time, this has had a very softening effect on the league, and it's one of the many reasons why old school basketball fans may see this current league as unrecognizable compared to the NBA from the 80s and 90s. So if the drink had simply missed our test and he never runs into the crowd, it's very possible that the league might be a little bit rougher and more intense today. That's only one side of the what if, though. Another overlooked aspect is how it affected the teams, but especially the Indiana Pacers. Indiana was coming off of a season where they had a top 3 defense, they had a 61-21 record and made it to the Eastern Conference Finals before being eliminated in Game 6 by the eventual champion Detroit Pistons. They responded by simply getting better heading into this season by adding a fantastic wing scorer in Steven Jackson. Along with that, Ron Artest was clearly on his way to a career year as he was just entering his prime. They looked like they might be the best team in the league, and the players knew it too.
You know, at that point, the whole league knew we were the best team in the league that year. We had the best record, and this game was our test to see where we were. You know, they were one of the best teams at the time. So we went there and blew them out. We were winning by 15 with like 45 seconds left.
They had defeated us the year before in the playoffs to move on to the finals and win. Ron and Jermaine were kind of having a butt of heads of whose team it was. I was like, you guys, it's neither of your teams, it's my team. Don't you guys understand, if we win this series, we're going to be NBA champs? Because I knew whoever we faced in the West, which turned out to be the Lakers, defense was going to win that championship. And the 2 best defensive teams at the time were Detroit and Indiana. I was like, if we win this series, we're going to be champs. But they couldn't understand that. And they go on to win the championship. And then, you know, obviously we're conference rivals, we're division rivals, and they just got into it. And that was nothing. That happens all the time. That was broken up. It's the cup that came in later
But that's what led up to the malice at the palace, as Ron Artest was then suspended for the rest of the season, which was a total of 74 games. Steven Jackson was suspended for 30 games, and Jermaine O'Neal was suspended for 25 games. Obviously, this completely ruined what could have been an eventual NBA champion, which would have been the only championship in the Indiana Pacers' NBA history, and it also would have given Reggie Miller a championship ring in his farewell season. Truly one of the more unfortunate what-ifs of basketball history.
There have been many crazy what-ifs throughout the long history of the NBA. For example, it's pretty well documented that Tim Duncan nearly joined Tracy McGrady on the Orlando Magic. If you've been around NBA YouTube very long, then you know very well that Michael Jordan and Akeem Olajuwon nearly became teammates as rookies and would have had Clyde Drexler alongside of them as well. And then of course, possibly the greatest what if in NBA history is what if Len Bias had lived, a player who seemed destined to be a rival to Michael Jordan just like he was in college. And he would have been joining a Boston Celtics team that was already a championship contender. But even with all that being the case, there are still plenty of other great what-ifs, and some of them are not just underrated, but are extremely unknown. Today, we're looking at some of those significant but under-recognized what-ifs of NBA history, and let me know in the comments if you think there are some other ones that are worth recognizing. So without further ado, let's get into it. First off, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar to the New York Knicks in 1974. As we all know, Kareem is one of, if not the greatest center in NBA history, and he won a championship with the Milwaukee Bucks before eventually going to the Los Angeles Lakers where he won 5 more rings. The thing is, that easily could have been New York instead of Los Angeles, because in September of 1974, his famous co-star for the Bucks, Oscar Robertson, retired. And afterwards, Kareem was unable to negotiate a new contract with the Milwaukee Bucks. He had grown frustrated with the situation and was ready to head to a new direction. It was at that point in October of 1974 that Kareem requested a trade, and he had a list of desired destinations. The first destination of choice was the New York Knicks, and his second choice was the Washington Bullets, and the third was the Los Angeles Lakers. Months passed, and later on in March of 1975, Kareem once again stated that he would like to be traded, but this time his preferred list had shrunk to just the New York Knicks or the Lakers, but preferably he wanted to go to New York. As you all know, eventually the trade materialized, but he was sent to Los Angeles, forever changing the course of history for Lakers basketball. But just take a moment and imagine if he had gone to New York instead. Willis Reed had just recently retired from the NBA, but with that being said, New York still had multiple stars and MVP candidates, in Walt Frazier and Earl the Pearl Monroe. So they had their perimeter locked down that made them a decent team, but what they needed was a superstar big man. And Kareem would have came in immediately and would have made them not only title contenders, but probably title favorites in what was an extremely competitive 1970s decade. One can only imagine how much the GOAT argument changes, how much legacies change, and how the perspectives of both the Knicks and the Lakers organization change if Kareem Abdul-Jabbar had gone to his preferred destination instead. The next what if is Dominique Wilkins to the Los Angeles Lakers in the 1982 NBA draft. The Lakers had the first overall pick in that draft, and with it they took big game James Worthy, who was a forward out of the University of North Carolina. Now Worthy was certainly a great acquisition for the Lakers and helped them go on to win multiple championships. In many ways, he was also the ideal running mate for Magic Johnson, as his speed and finishing ability made him a tremendous threat in transition. But even with all that in mind, Dominique Wilkins is simply one of the greatest scorers in the history of the league, and went on to be a franchise cornerstone for the Atlanta Hawks. He ended up being the third overall pick, but if the Lakers had taken Dominique instead, then that likely would have translated to some of the greatest highlight reels that we had ever seen. Just imagine Magic Johnson leading the Showtime offense, throwing lob passes to Dominique Wilkins.
Imagine how many fast break plays would have ended with 360s, windmills, and ferocious dunks. It would have been some of the most fascinating basketball that we've ever seen. And on top of that, I think the Lakers dynasty becomes even better, seeing how Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Magic Johnson, and Dominique Wilkins were all capable of leading teams to be contenders. Arguably, it would have been the strongest and most intimidating three-headed monster of all time. But again, I honestly think the most unfortunate thing about it not happening is all the highlights that we didn't get. Next is Magic Johnson to the Chicago Bulls. Many years ago, the NBA draft had very, very different rules. And one of those rules was that the worst team in the Western Conference and the worst team in the Eastern Conference would have the first overall pick decided by a coin flip. At the time, the New Orleans Jazz were the worst in the West, while the Chicago Bulls were the worst in the East. But the thing is, the Los Angeles Lakers had the rights to the New Orleans Jazz pick because of a previous trade, and leading the rookie class that season was none other than Earvin Magic Johnson, meaning that the future of the Bulls organization, the Lakers organization, and one of the greatest players of all time all ended up being determined by a coin flip. The Chicago Bulls made the call, and they called tails, and it ended up being heads, solidifying Magic's future as a Los Angeles Laker. Now, what if Magic had ended up on the Bulls instead? This changes so much. The formation of the Showtime Lakers never happens. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar surely ends up with less championships on his resume, with a lack of Magic Johnson by his side. Larry Bird probably ends up with way more championships now that he doesn't have Magic Johnson on a stacked Lakers team in his path. Although, we would have had a lot more battles between Magic and Bird, seeing that now they would both be in the Eastern Conference. And probably the biggest ripple effect is the fact that if Magic Johnson is on the Chicago Bulls since 1979, then they're probably not bad enough to have the third overall pick in the 1984 NBA draft, which means they're never in a position to take Michael Jordan in the first place. This single what if changes the trajectory and the history of the most prestigious NBA franchises of all time. And it also changes the legacies of Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Larry Bird, Magic Johnson, and Michael Jordan. 4 different GOAT candidates all end up with a much different career, all because of a coin flip. As all of you know, Michael Jordan is the most iconic basketball player of all time, and most people agree that he's the greatest player of all time. So naturally, there's going to be a lot of speculation and what-ifs tied to his career, and the list of those go on, and I've talked about those for hours on this channel. But if you ask me, the greatest Michael Jordan what-if is one that is very rarely talked about. It wasn't about Jordan's first retirement, it wasn't about his second retirement and their chance at winning a 7th championship, but for me, it was actually about his return in his Wizards years. Listen, I'm fully aware that most people are not going to agree with me about this being his greatest what-if, but for me, this one is just the most fascinating. So here's the deal. This is an article from 2005, and from an interview, Jordan was quoted to say that he felt used by the Washington Wizards organization. You see, MJ was the team's general manager before he stepped down to play with the team, and Jordan assumed that as soon as his 2 years were done playing with the Wizards, he would then assume his position as an executive for Washington. Unfortunately, Abe Pollin, who was the owner of the organization, decided to cut ties with Michael Jordan almost immediately after he was done playing. This led MJ to say that if he knew that he was going to be used this way by Abe Pollin and that he wasn't going to be resuming his general manager position after his playing days were done, then he wouldn't have come back to play for the Washington Wizards in the first place. That's where the what if comes in. Because if MJ didn't come back to play for the Wizards, who would he have played for instead? Now, some might theorize that Michael Jordan would have just remained retired. And although that is certainly a possibility, I think that is extremely unlikely. MJ has been vocal about the fact that one of the motivating factors for him coming back to play was to prove that he could still compete against some of the best players in the game. and he described it many times as having an itch. He just had that itch that he had to scratch. He had to come back to play the game of basketball professionally because he still believed he had something left in the tank. Personally, I think that itch would have been too strong for MJ to ignore. To know that answer for sure, you'd have to ask MJ. And honestly, if I could ever confront him, that would be the question that I would ask him. If you didn't come back and play for Washington, would you have come back to play at all? And if you did, what team would you have played for? Today, that's what that video is about, as I'm theorizing which team Michael Jordan would have returned to play for if he didn't come back to play for the Wizards. Now first off, let me address the teams that Michael Jordan definitely would not have gone to. First off is the Washington Wizards, naturally because that's what this video premise is about. The second team is the Chicago Bulls, and this might seem surprising to some, but not really once you understand the context. At the time, Jerry Krause was still the general manager of the Chicago Bulls, and him and MJ famously had a very tumultuous relationship. There is absolutely no way that Michael Jordan comes back to play for Jerry once again. The Bulls also still had Tim Floyd as their head coach, which is the guy who was being groomed to replace Phil Jackson, and Krause pushed out Jackson for that replacement. This entire situation would be repulsive to MJ. No matter how strong his itch was, I think Jordan would rather remain retired than come back and play for this organization at that point. The third team that MJ definitely would not have came back to play for is the Indiana Pacers. Michael Jordan did have a friend on that squad, which was Reggie Miller, and maybe that would have been a nice merger for the two veteran stars. But the ultimate deal breaker was the fact that Isaiah Thomas was the head coach of the Pacers at that point. Everyone knows that Isaiah and Michael had a bitter rivalry on the court, and still hold harsh feelings towards one another even to this day. There's absolutely no way that Jordan would have embraced a situation where Isaiah Thomas is an authority figure above him. The fourth and final team that I can say with certainty that Jordan wouldn't have come back to play for was the New York Knicks. Yes, at some point there was some connections and some rumors between Jordan and the Knicks, but that was before the situation happened with Jeff Van Gundy. Van Gundy was still New York's coach at that time, and Michael was really known to hold grudges. And after Van Gundy's famous con man comments about Michael Jordan several years earlier, I would really have a hard time seeing MJ trusting Van Gundy again in any kind of coworker relationship. As we all know, Michael is a guy who will cut all ties completely if you say something against him personally. Look at his relationship with Charles Barkley as an example. So now that I've addressed all the teams that Michael Jordan would not have come back to play for, who were the most likely teams that he would have come back to play for? First off, the Los Angeles Lakers. At the time, the Lakers had just won back-to-back NBA championships and were looking to complete a three-peat. Obviously, there would have been some pre-existing chemistry, considering the fact that Phil Jackson was the Lakers' head coach. He also could have embraced a mentorship role over a young Kobe Bryant, and I'm sure Kobe would have embraced that as well. Obviously, he'd be immediately competing for a 7th NBA championship ring. But it's tough to say whether Jordan would have wanted to join a team that had already done everything that was needed to win championships. Yes, he could reconnect with Phil, he could be teammates with Shaq, and he could mentor Kobe. But would he accept a role as a third option on a team that was already a champion? It's tough to say. The second team that he may have gone to is the Portland Trail Blazers. He had some familiar faces on that squad, as Scottie Pippen and Steve Kerr were on the Blazers at this point. And yes, Portland was a championship contender in the early 2000s. But heading into the 01-02 season, Portland was kind of on the downswing, as Arvydas Sabonis was no longer on the roster, and much of the team was really getting up there in their basketball years. There was also a lot of negative media attention around the Blazers at this point, and they had even been nicknamed the Jailblazers for some time, due to all the issues that they were having off the court. It's tough to say whether Michael Jordan would have been okay getting his squeaky clean image involved with that organization. Plus, it's also tough to say what his relationship was exactly like with Scottie Pippen at this time. Would Pippen have even embraced MJ at that point? Regardless, I think there's enough evidence to say that he would at least have to consider it. The third team that Michael Jordan could have joined is actually the New Jersey Nets. This would have been a really interesting situation, as they were a contender in the Eastern Conference. Rod Thorne was the general manager of the Nets at that time, and he was actually the man who drafted Michael Jordan for the Chicago Bulls in 1984. Rod famously has had a close relationship with Michael Jordan, and there is even the rumor that MJ once told Rod that he wouldn't be on the Dream Team if Isaiah Thomas was on it. That may or may not be true, but one thing that is true is that Michael Jordan has a very exclusive circle of trust, and Rod was one of those guys who were in it. He would have been playing alongside of the best point guard in the game at that point, Jason Kidd, and they also had a strong power forward in Kenyon Martin. Jordan likely would have started ahead of the 6'10 small forward Keith Van Horn. If MJ decided to go back to Rod Thorne and play for the New Jersey Nets, I think they still end up making it to the NBA Finals, but they probably still end up losing to the Los Angeles Lakers. But this time, instead of being swept, they probably win a game or two. Regardless, the acquisition of MJ would do nothing about the Nets' inability to contain Shaq. The fourth and final team that I believe Michael Jordan could have returned to play for is actually the Orlando Magic. In the summer of 2001, the Magic signed Patrick Ewing on July 18th, which was well before MJ made his official decision on where he was going to play, and Patrick was one of Jordan's best friends. So it's possible that MJ could have followed him there and have that be their final swan song together. MJ also could have embraced a mentorship role with the Orlando Magic superstar Tracy McGrady. Also consider the fact that Horace Grant returned to the Magic that season, which gives MJ yet another familiar face. Figuring out the starting lineup for that group would have been difficult, since the team had T-Mac, Grant Hill, and potentially Michael Jordan, who are all shooting guards / small forwards. Eventually, the situation would have resolved itself, since Grant Hill only played in 14 games that season due to an injury. My guess is that they probably make it as far as the Eastern Conference semis, before they were eliminated by Jason Kidd and a deeper New Jersey Nets team. So ultimately, to get a real definitive answer, you'd have to ask MJ himself. But if you ask me, one of the four teams he would have returned to play for are the Los Angeles Lakers, the Portland Trail Blazers, the New Jersey Nets, or the Orlando Magic. In this situation, I believe the only scenario where MJ ends up winning a 7th championship ring is if he joined the Los Angeles Lakers, completing the three-peat from 2000 to 2002. Would it have meant much to his legacy? Probably not, considering that Shaq and Kobe were the clear engines of that squad. Still, it's cool to think about. So now I'll leave the question up to you guys. If Michael Jordan did not return to come back to play for the Wizards due to his soured relationship with the organization, which team would you have liked to see him come back to play for instead? And what do you think would have been the outcome?
Let me first clarify, you saw what the video title is, but what may be an even more descriptive title would be NBA series that determine the pecking order. What I essentially mean is specific playoff series in NBA history that went a certain way, but if it had gone differently, then it would have completely switched the all-time rankings of the two superstars involved. To me, this video is a very simple concept, but it's also a fascinating topic, because it really shows you the significance of each playoff series and of each individual game, and sometimes of even one shot. In one evening, a player's legacy can be completely altered for decades to come, simply based on how he performs against the other star on that specific night. Hopefully, this all makes sense, but if not, you'll get it by the end of the first segment. So without further ado, let's get into it. First off, Larry Bird and Magic Johnson in the 1987 NBA Finals. This was the third time that these two rivals met up in the finals during the 1980s, and it was massive in terms of bragging rights.
because the winner of that series was taking a 2-championships-to-1 lead in those 80s matchups. Well, as you all know, Magic Johnson and the Lakers went on to defeat the Celtics in 6 games. Magic put up monstrous averages, was the finals MVP, and even had the iconic game-winning hook shot in Game 4. But even more significant than that was the fact that Magic secured his 5th championship ring compared to Bird's 3. And one of the lasting images from that battle was when Larry was in a press conference after suffering defeat and admitted that he believed Magic Johnson was simply the better player.
Magic's just a great basketball player. He's the best I've ever seen, you know. Unbelievable. I don't know what to say.
Now, over 3 decades later, Magic Johnson is usually recognized as the player who's higher on the all-time list. But I honestly believe that all changes if the Celtics had won the series. Think about it. Larry Bird was leading Magic in MVP awards at that point 3-2, and Bird had just won 3 out of the last 4 MVP awards. Many people were already thinking that Larry was the better individual player. If the Celtics had won, Magic would have just 4 championships to Larry Bird's 4, and Bird would then also have the edge in Finals MVPs 3-2. Beyond that, Bird would have the last laugh, defeating Magic 2 out of the 3 times that they met on the game's biggest stage. Not only was this one series so massive, but you could even argue that the legacies were defined on the last shot of Game 4. If Bird buries that game winner, then the Celtics would have had a commanding 3-2 lead by the end of Game 5. But alas, he missed the shot, and the Lakers went on to close out the series soon afterwards. This whole thing really gives you some perspective on just how closely competitive their rivalry truly was. Next up, LeBron James and Steph Curry in the 2016 NBA Finals. You all know this series. It was the second straight time that these two teams met up in the NBA Finals, and they would go on to battle on the game's biggest stage in 4 seasons straight. The Warriors were looking to complete a historic season where they had finished the regular season with a 73-9 record, which was the greatest in NBA history. Steph Curry had also broke the record for the most three-pointers made in a single season. He just had the highest scoring 50-40-90 season ever, and he was named the back-to-back MVP winner, as he became the first and only unanimous MVP in NBA history. I remember the narrative during that regular season, and people were saying that Steph Curry had now replaced LeBron James as the face of the league. But as you all know, LeBron emphatically shut down that narrative as he led his Cavs to make a 3-1 comeback, winning the series in 7 games, while giving Cleveland their first championship in franchise history. Here's the thing, everything changes if Cleveland had lost that series. Even LeBron James recognizes how critical the 2016 championship is to his GOAT case. If LeBron had lost that series, then he only has 3 championships. 2 of them came on a super team, and the other was the Orlando bubble in 2020. He would have a record of 3-7 in the NBA Finals, and he would have been eliminated by Steph Curry's Warriors a whopping 4 seasons straight. In this scenario, he would have never defeated Steph in the NBA Finals. On the other hand, Steph would have 5 championship rings instead of 4, and it would have completed the 73-9 season with a championship, which probably would have solidified them as the consensus greatest team ever. Steph also would have won 4 straight championships, which Michael Jordan and Kobe Bryant never did. If Kyrie Irving doesn't hit that 3, and if LeBron doesn't get that blocked shot, then I believe we would be having debates today about whether Steph Curry or Michael Jordan is the greatest player of all time, rather than LeBron James and MJ. Next on the list is Akeem Olajuwon and David Robinson in the 1995 Western Conference Finals. Nowadays, basically everyone has Olajuwon higher on their all-time list than Robinson. But during their peaks, there was a legitimate debate on who the better center was. When the 2 centers squared off in 1995, David Robinson had just won the league MVP. And Olajuwon has been quite frank in the years since about how that was a motivating factor for him. He absolutely decimated the Admiral in that series, nearly dropping 40 points in 4 out of the 6 games. Obviously, after Houston closed out the Spurs in 6, they went on to win the championship over the Orlando Magic in the finals. Now, there's no guarantee that the Spurs would have gone on to beat a talented Orlando Magic team, but if they had, the legacy comparison would have been overwhelmingly in favor of Robinson, as he would have a total of 3 championship rings to Hakeem's 1. And like all the other comparisons, the lasting impression of Robinson winning the Battle of the Bigs would have been monumental in how we remember the two. Even if the Spurs went on to lose to the Magic in the finals, Robinson would still have 2 rings to Olajuwon's 1. And with his victory in their playoff battle, that would likely push his case over the hump. On the other hand, Olajuwon already has to deal with this narrative. But if he had only won 1 championship in 1994, which just happened to be the full season that Jordan was retired, then the narrative would only be stronger that he was only able to eat well because MJ wasn't around. Last on the list is Michael Jordan and Magic Johnson in the 1991 NBA Finals. This was a highly anticipated and extremely hyped matchup between the guy seen as the face of the league and the guy seen as the future face of the league. When it comes down to it, Jordan and the Bulls simply had the better roster, as they closed out the series in just 5 games. Not only do I believe that this series would have shifted their rankings if it had gone differently, but I believe it would have them completely switch places as to who's widely recognized as the greatest player of all time. You need to understand, the Lakers didn't win this series and they should not have won this series. Magic no longer had the assistance of Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who had retired somewhat recently. On top of that, Magic's Lakers were shorthanded, as his 2 best scoring weapons, James Worthy and Byron Scott, both missed significant time in the finals due to injuries. Even against all odds, if Magic somehow won the title instead of Jordan, it would give Magic 6 rings to Jordan's 5, and it would be the lasting image of Magic's career that he bested Jordan in his final season, in a series that he wasn't supposed to win. For MJ, it would have been a whole new damning narrative, that he was never able to win until Magic allowed him to by retiring. People would be saying that Magic was the face of the 80s, and he could have been the face of the 90s if he didn't get HIV. From that perspective, in that reality, I don't see how anyone could have comfortably referred to Michael Jordan as the greatest player of all time when Magic Johnson had that as his legacy. The 07 to 08 Boston Celtics, otherwise known as Boston's Big Three, they adamantly won the NBA championship, destroying Kobe Bryant and the Los Angeles Lakers by 39 points in the 6th game of the NBA Finals. For Celtics fans, their championship is extremely memorable. For Lakers fans like myself, it's also extremely memorable, but for all the wrong reasons. The thing is, in the years since, Boston's retired stars continue to run their mouths about their success, as if they were a full-blown dynasty. It's so well known on social media amongst the basketball community that it's basically become a meme at this point. So now this team's success has become somewhat blurry when we look upon it in hindsight. Some now think they're not as good as advertised, while others still believe they're extremely underrated. So seeing that I have vivid memories of this squad and still hate them to this day with a burning passion, how do they stand in my mind among the great teams of league history? Well, for starters, let's take a look back at how that team assembled. The 06 to 07 Boston Celtics were a complete disaster. The team struggled with their chemistry, and thanks to Paul Pierce's injuries that caused him to miss nearly half of the season, they struggled to produce much offense, finishing in the bottom 3 spots of the league. They were a lottery team that finished the regular season with only a 24-58 record. Needless to say, Danny Ainge and the rest of the Celtics upper management were looking to make some major changes heading into that offseason. Their first big move was acquiring the all-time great sharpshooting star, Ray Allen, in a draft day trade. On paper, the tandem of Pierce and Allen made them a dark horse contender in the Eastern Conference.
But it was their next move that truly shook the basketball world, as Boston pulled off a blockbuster trade, acquiring the former league MVP, Kevin Garnett. The day this trade went down, I remember telling my father that the Celtics were going to win the NBA championship. Defensively, they were the best team Boston had seen in decades, and they were suffocating their opponents on a nightly basis. On the offensive end, they complemented each other's play styles perfectly, and with Garnett leading the team as the emotional leader, a bond was formed between several veterans who were starving for a championship. They steamrolled the regular season, winning 66 games, which was the most that the franchise had experienced since Larry Bird's MVP seasons. At one point, the Houston Rockets were on a historic 22-game winning streak, where they defeated many of the league's strongest contenders. But it was these Celtics who emphatically put a stop to that streak, as they went into the Rockets building and destroyed them by 20 points, holding Houston to only 74 points on the night. The postseason would prove to be tough for Boston, as each of their 4 playoff series went to at least 6 games. But when it was all said and done, they ultimately prevailed as champions, cementing themselves among the great teams of Celtics history. It was truly the perfect time for these 3 stars to come together and succeed, as they were each now in their early 30s and just starting to exit the prime of their careers. The thing is, due to the fact that they were starting to show their age and the fact that they only won a single championship, many people view this team as a bit of a one-hit wonder. Some say things like they had the opportunity and seized the opportunity, but ultimately the squad wasn't good enough to win multiple championships. Therefore, they can't be considered among the great teams of basketball history. And let me be clear, this is a narrative that I strongly disagree with. I believe this Boston team was on their way to being a dynasty, but unfortunately, they ran into disastrous circumstances that were out of their control. To begin the 08-09 season, Boston looked like they were poised to repeat as champions and were once again crushing the league defensively. Unfortunately for Boston, 2/3 into the regular season, the Celtics' reigning Defensive Player of the Year and arguably their best player, Kevin Garnett, suffered a season-ending knee injury. Without KG available for the playoffs, Boston's championship hopes basically immediately went up in smoke. At the time of Garnett's injury, Boston was tied for the best record in the Eastern Conference, and regardless of the fact that arguably their best player missed 25 games of the regular season, they still finished with a 62-20 record. I understand that Kobe and the Lakers won the championship that season, but my feeling throughout that regular season was that Boston was still the better team, and that Los Angeles wasn't quite ready for their physicality, at least until they would acquire Ron Artest in the following offseason. So to recap, Boston emphatically won in 2008, and I personally believe that it hadn't been for Garnett's injury, they would have won again in 2009. As we all know, the Lakers and Celtics had their highly anticipated finals rematch in 2010, and the series went to a hard-fought 7th game where the Lakers narrowly prevailed by a final score of 83-79. But keep in mind, Boston starting center Kendrick Perkins went down with a season-ending injury in Game 6, and was dearly missed in the 7th and deciding game. Now before you laugh because it's quote, only Kendrick Perkins, ask any Celtics fan who was closely watching at that point, and they'll tell you about his value to the team. Perkins was Boston's starting center and had the best year of his career, averaging close to a double-double and 1.7 blocks in only 27 minutes per game. Not only that, but in many ways, he was the team's enforcer physically. Perkins was the kind of guy who would make you think twice before you attack the basket, and he had a significant impact on the game in terms of the team's interior defense and rebounding. Now with that in mind, consider how Game 7 played out in the absence of Perkins. Of all games in the series, no game had a bigger deficit in rebounding than in Game 7, and that advantage went to the Lakers. Kobe Bryant had his playoff season high with 15 rebounds, and Pau Gasol put up a monstrous 18 rebounds. Not only did the Lakers destroy the Celtics on the boards, but they also demolished them with the points in the paint, and both of these areas is where Perkins usually had a significant impact. When you consider the fact that this came down to the final few possessions, you realize that a healthy Perkins likely would have been the winning touch for Boston. Now, let's recap again. Boston won in 2008. An injury possibly kept them from winning in 2009, and an injury likely kept them from winning in 2010. This team had a very realistic shot at three-peating in their first few seasons together and becoming a dynasty. After that, the Celtics stars were in their mid-30s and had officially begun their decline, and the Big Three's Miami Heat eliminated them in back-to-back seasons from the playoffs. Now, the point of this video isn't about making excuses for Boston, because in reality, conditioning and remaining healthy for the playoffs is something that has always been a factor for winning championships. But the point I'm trying to make is that the Big Three Celtics were much better than their single championship would indicate. They had the makings of a dynasty and were talented enough to do it, but when it came to injuries and the timing of them, they simply had an extreme case of bad luck. This is the reason why I don't have a problem with the Big Three Celtics gloating about their lone 2008 championship, because I truly believe that they were every bit as good as they think they were. It was three starving superstars coming together, working together, achieving basketball immortality, and they added to the legacy of one of the most prestigious franchises of NBA history.
When you think of the late 2000s, a handful of superstars usually come to mind. Kobe Bryant on his quest to win rings without Shaq, LeBron James in his peak Cleveland form, Dwayne Wade carrying Miami, Dwight Howard in his prime, and the Boston Celtics Big Three causing havoc in the Eastern Conference. But one player who's since been forgotten by many was the Portland Trail Blazers' former star, Brandon Roy. Roy is yet another example of a star who had potential that reached the sky, but unfortunately, severe injuries ruined that potential and kept him from having a long and healthy career. Even though Roy's career was ultimately cut extremely short, many of us still got to witness his incredible talent on display, and I'm here to tell you about it. He was a 6'6" shooting guard who was selected with the 6th overall pick in the 2006 NBA draft by the Minnesota Timberwolves. Although Minnesota selected him, Portland had the next pick and was hoping to draft Roy after he had an excellent pre-draft workout with the team. Due to this, Portland mustered up a trade package that included the rights to draft Randy Foye, and Minnesota agreed to the deal, sending Brandon to the Blazers to begin his career. At this point, the Blazers organization was in desperate need of a spark, as they had missed the playoffs the previous few seasons and were coming off a year where they had the worst record in the entire league. Due to this, there was no time to develop Brandon slowly, as they were immediately plugging him into the starting lineup and giving him a full workload of minutes. He immediately made a strong first impression as he scored 20 points in his first game against his hometown team, the Seattle Supersonics, and in his second game, he poured in 19, 6, and 5 against the Golden State Warriors. He had a silky smooth game that didn't rely much on athleticism, but instead on his skills and fundamentals. I wouldn't describe him as explosive, but as methodical and intelligent. He had an elite handle on the basketball and had a lethal pull-up jumper. He also had a quick first step and was a fantastic finisher in the paint. To put it simply, he was an isolation nightmare for the opposing defender. At the end of his debut season, he had improved Portland's record by 11 wins over the previous season, and was rewarded with the Rookie of the Year trophy. In his rookie campaign, he had a stat line average of 16.8 points, 4.4 rebounds, 4 assists, and 1.2 steals on 45.6% shooting. Beginning with his sophomore season, Roy's production, skills, and confidence would improve significantly, as he was named an NBA All-Star 3 seasons straight. At his regular season peak, he was averaging about 23 points, 5 rebounds, and 5 assists on 48% shooting, and a solid 37.7% from three-point range. Not only that, but Roy was quickly establishing himself as one of the most clutch players in the entire league, as his elite one-on-one capabilities were consistently paying off in fourth quarter situations. This was especially the case in the 08-09 season, where he had numerous game winners and finished that season among the league leaders in fourth quarter shots made in one-possession games. The most iconic of those was the sequence against the Rockets, where he hit a tough jumper with only a few seconds left, which he then followed up with a deep 3 buzzer beater to win the contest. Throughout the regular season, he had numerous other evenings where he caught the attention of the basketball world, like on December 18th, where he dropped 52 points, 6 assists, and 5 rebounds against the contending Phoenix Suns, and also on January 24th against the Washington Wizards, where he achieved a franchise record 10 steals. Later in that postseason is where he truly displayed what he was capable of. It was the first round of the 2009 Western Conference playoffs against the Houston Rockets, and Roy was torching elite defenders like Ron Artest and Shane Battier. In Game 2, he dropped a monstrous 42 points and 7 rebounds on 55.6% shooting, leading his Blazers to a 4-point victory. On the series as a whole, he averaged 26.7 points, 4.8 rebounds, 1.3 steals, and 1.2 blocks on 46% shooting and 47% from three-point range. As a player in his early 20s, this was the absolute peak of his powers, and the sky was the limit as he was rewarded with a max contract from the Blazers organization. Sadly, this was as good as it got, as it was only downhill from this point on. In the 2010 season, Roy suffered his first major knee injury in the NBA, as he suffered a bone contusion and a meniscus tear. Later on, it was discovered that Roy was missing a significant amount of cartilage in his knees, which required arthroscopic knee surgery on both knees. Unfortunately, even these surgeries weren't enough to save his career. Roy said that his knees had degenerated to such a point that there wasn't any cartilage between the bones in both of his knees. Due to this, he retired from the game of basketball at only the age of 26. A couple years later, he tried to make a comeback, but he only played a total of 5 games as a member of the Minnesota Timberwolves and made very minor contributions. Sadly, what ended the comeback was yet another injury to his right knee, which was initially only supposed to sideline him for a month. But the injury ultimately proved to be too severe, as it kept him out for several months before Minnesota was done waiting and decided to release him, which was unfortunately the final nail in the coffin of his career. Despite being done with basketball while still in his 20s, Roy kept a positive attitude and said this after his release: "Anytime you walk away from the game, you have what ifs. I feel like I was able to answer those questions last year by going out there and giving it a try." At his peak, Roy was one of the most dangerous players in the game, and even the legendary Kobe Bryant agreed, as he stated in 2010 that Roy was the hardest player to guard in the Western Conference, and he had no weaknesses in his game.
So in the past couple of years, Gilbert Arenas has been a guy that I usually disagree with. He's a guy who usually has some pretty hot takes, and tends to say some really harsh things about some players from past generations. With that being said, I do recognize his brilliance in making hot takes, knowing how to stir up conversation, and knowing how to bring attention to his podcast. And as a YouTuber, I leverage that as well. But with that being said, I got nothing negative to say about him today, because what I heard him recently say is one of the best takes that I think I've ever heard him say. So rather than me just blabbering on about it, let me go ahead and let you guys take a listen.
If the number 1 picks went to the teams that the rest of the number 1's pick went to. Like, so if Magic if he went to the Jazz that year, or if he went to Cleveland that year, is he winning a championship in the first 5 years of his career like he did 3? No, right? If Tim Duncan didn't go to the Spurs and he went to the last 2-3 teams, is he Tim Duncan? Because Wemby has to go to the Spurs. But if Wemby went to Boston, if Wemby went to Milwaukee, and with his talent, they're gonna be trending to win the championship in the next 2 years. Now you're talking about a dude in his first 5 years got 3 championships. Now his legacy is cemented as this great, all because he got drafted to a better team because something happened the year before. The only person who built their legacy from trash to greatness is Michael Jordan. When you talk about Magic, we know where he got drafted and his team and the greatness of it. Same thing with Bird. Jordan is the only one who struggled his first 5-6 years and then built championships. He became champion and then he gets to fall off at the end because he's already a 5-time champion, right? Same thing with Bird. Same thing with Tim Duncan. They win in their first 2-3 years. They got championship cemented. So now they don't have to do nothing.
Yeah.
Braun, Wemby, Dwight Howard, all these number 1 picks, they come in a bottom feeding team. So their first 6-7 years, they're like salmon. They're up swimming. Yeah. So now we're like, yeah, you haven't won in 2-5 years, man. You just over here grabbing these. And look what teams they supposed to be that bad.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. What if Braun would have went to Detroit instead of Cleveland?
GOAT.
Like
The real GOAT.
Like
How many
like-
championships?
Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, what if he went to Detroit his first year?
So in that long clip, what Gilbert was essentially talking about was situational greatness. And this is something I've brought up a lot in basketball debates. Yes, championship rings are important when we're trying to gauge a player's greatness. But using rings as a very simple way of ranking one player above another is kind of a shallow way of doing it because it lacks this context. He makes a great point that some first overall picks inherited a great situation, while others genuinely went to one of the worst teams in the entire league. Two of the examples he mentioned in his podcast was Magic Johnson and Tim Duncan. Magic Johnson going to the Lakers was literally determined by a coin flip. If the coin flip had gone the other way, then he would have ended up going to a rebuilding Chicago Bulls team instead, which is a Bulls franchise that never really had much success before or after Michael Jordan. When Magic went to the Lakers, they already had Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and were ready to win championships immediately. Yes, Magic was great in his rookie season and stepped up in the NBA Finals with one of the greatest playoff performances of all time. But with that being said, he's not even going to be in a position to win that championship if he was on the Chicago Bulls roster instead. So this got me thinking, what are some other players and some other situations in basketball history that completely changed the dynamic if just one thing was slightly different? Back in the day, in the early to mid 2000s, there was a genuine debate about who was the best power forward in the entire league. Obviously, you had guys like Tim Duncan in that conversation. Dirk Nowitzki was in that conversation as well. And for a little bit of time, there was also Chris Webber. And I remember vividly, from 2000 to 2005, I actually thought it might have been Kevin Garnett. But the thing is, KG played on the Minnesota Timberwolves, and that is a franchise that has never won a championship. And when you look at a supporting cast, sure, he might have some decent players, but it's not the championship supporting cast that Tim Duncan had. Tim Duncan had guys like Tony Parker, Manu Ginobili, a Defensive Player of the Year candidate in Bruce Bowen, and for a little while, he had David Robinson, who was a 20 points per game scorer and was one of the best defensive players in the entire league. I've always believed that if you put Kevin Garnett in a Spurs jersey and put Tim Duncan in a Timberwolves jersey, their championships might completely flip. We might be looking at the legacy of Kevin Garnett in 2024 as a guy with 5 championship rings, and who was widely viewed as the greatest power forward of all time. And just maybe, Tim Duncan's the guy who only has 1. Even if you're not quite as generous and say KG ends up with 3 or 4, and Tim Duncan ends up with 2 or 3. Still, how does that dramatically change the debate on who's the greatest power forward of all time? Another good example is a guy like Carmelo Anthony. When he was drafted, he went to the Denver Nuggets, and it took a little while for them to become Western Conference contenders. And as we all know, Carmelo never ended up winning that championship ring, although he did get decently close in 2009. Nowadays, Carmelo is widely seen as a guy who was a great bucket getter, but also as a guy who didn't do the extra things needed to win a championship. But is that narrative actually accurate, or does it have to do more with the reality of the situation he inherited? Heading into the 2003 NBA draft, basically everyone knew that LeBron James was going to go first overall to the Cleveland Cavaliers. But a lot of people thought that the second overall pick, which was going to the Detroit Pistons, was going to be Carmelo Anthony. But instead, they took Darko Milicic, who ended up being one of the biggest busts in NBA history. They did that because they were picking based on position needs and not based on talent. But if they had done that, Carmelo would have been joining a team that went on to be one of the greatest defensive teams in NBA history. You know, the 03 to 04 Detroit Pistons, who ended up beating a super team Los Angeles Lakers to win the championship, while breaking all kinds of defensive records along the way. Now, some might say that Carmelo might have thrown off their chemistry and might have changed up the blueprint of that team, but honestly, I don't think so, man. You add a player that talented to that 2004 Detroit Pistons team, and I don't see how they still don't win a championship. Imagine Carmelo being the top scorer on a championship team in his rookie season. How does that change his legacy? And another example is Kobe Bryant. As much as I love Kobe, do you think he has 3 championship rings at the age of 23 if he was never traded away from Charlotte on draft day? Of course not. Yes, Kobe was great at a young age, but he still needed the right supporting cast to win that three-peat, including a prime Shaquille O'Neal. In Charlotte, that's not even happening. And then what? Are we looking at a career of Kobe Bryant where he has 2 or 3 championship rings instead of 5? How does that change his legacy? Now, Gilbert's take on Michael Jordan is fantastic, because for me personally, that really is a strong reason why I consider Michael Jordan the greatest player of all time. MJ didn't inherit a good situation. He went to the Chicago Bulls with a 3rd overall pick because the team was truly just that bad. Michael Jordan took that organization from trash to treasure and led them to win 6 championships. I love Magic, and I am a die-hard Lakers fan, but even I have to acknowledge that Magic Johnson was drafted in 1979 onto a Lakers team that already had Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and Michael Jordan was drafted in 1984 to a Chicago Bulls team that had basically nothing. Yet somehow, MJ ended up with more rings than Magic Johnson. If that doesn't tell you the greatness of MJ's impact, then I don't know what will. Imagine if Jordan had inherited a situation like the Philadelphia 76ers or the Boston Celtics in the mid-80s. How early is he collecting championships at that point? Remember, MJ didn't win his first championship ring until his late 20s. So maybe then we're looking at a legacy where he has 8 or 9 championship rings. And as Gilbert pointed out, that same thing applies to LeBron James. He was selected 1st overall by the Cleveland Cavaliers, but the 2nd overall pick was the Detroit Pistons. Now imagine a rookie LeBron on that 2004 Detroit Pistons squad. It wouldn't even be fair. They would go on a dominant championship run for like the next 5 seasons. So ultimately, I understand that this is all hypotheticals, and some of you are going to raise that point in the comments section below. But even with that being the case, I still think you gotta acknowledge the reality that not everybody is dealt the same hand. Some guys are given pocket aces, and some guys got a 7-2 offsuit. But regardless, they still gotta do the best they can with the hand they're given. So now I'm turning it to you guys. Who are some good examples of players who either could have benefited with a much better legacy, or could have had their legacy knocked down a few pegs if just one thing was slightly different about their career? For as long as the NBA has existed, playoff series have been determined by a multiple game format. In the 50s, many victors were determined in a best-of-3 series, and then it was the more common best-of-5 series. And nowadays, every series is determined in a best-of-7 format. But never before has an NBA championship been determined in a one-and-done format, like it is in the NCAA tournament and in the NFL playoffs. So what if we made every NBA Finals of league history a best-of-1, and determined the winners by using the first game of each NBA Finals series? How would that change the game's history, and how would it affect the way we view the greatest players of all time? Let me start by saying this was not my idea, or even my own research. This is just my evaluation of someone else's research. This one-and-done project was done by a viewer who goes by the name of HawkinsR13 on Instagram. I've included a link to his Instagram in the pinned comment if you want to give him a follow. I've also included a link to the project itself if you would like to observe the findings for yourself. Now before we get into it, let me first elaborate on the benefits and limitations of this format. Using a one-and-done format and using it to predict the entirety of playoff history would be utterly impossible to do accurately, so that's why it's limited to just the NBA Finals. Also, this isn't necessarily a 100% accurate representation of what would have actually happened under this new format, because with different circumstances comes potentially different outcomes. A one-game winner-take-all championship would create a greater sense of urgency, would add an element of desperation, and the stronger sense of pressure would probably affect a lot of players differently than simply the first game of the NBA Finals. So it is impossible to know for sure, but regardless, this can be a fun exercise, and an interesting way to reimagine the NBA, so we'll take the information we've got. So now that we've established all of that, let's get into it. So first off, what stands out? Well, unfortunately, the Cavaliers and the Trailblazers each lose their lone championships in 2016 and 1977. Although cities who have never won a ring, like Utah's Jazz and OKC's Thunder, now have a championship banner of their own. In this alternate universe, the Lakers have the most championships by a franchise at 17, which is now 3 ahead of the Boston Celtics. Which, let's be honest, just makes this a much better universe. One of the individual players who would be the most affected is the Lakers legend and the logo himself, Jerry West. Despite his all-time great career, people don't usually put West in the GOAT conversation, but under this new format, he certainly would be in the mix. West would go from only being a one-time NBA champion to a 3-time champion, and would also add a second Finals MVP to his trophy collection. Speaking of being a GOAT candidate, how do the other greatest players of all time stack up against one another? Well, based on my own personal GOAT series on this channel, my 9 GOAT candidates are Michael Jordan, LeBron James, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Wilt Chamberlain, Bill Russell, Magic Johnson, Larry Bird, Kobe Bryant, and Tim Duncan. Now what's interesting is that 5 out of these 9 GOAT candidates actually have less championships under this new format, and only 2 out of the 9 candidates gain championships. Let's start with Michael Jordan. MJ's legacy takes a major hit, which jeopardizes his standing as the GOAT in the eyes of most basketball fans, as his championships decrease from 6 to only 4, and his Finals MVPs also decrease from 6 to 4. Kobe Bryant. Kobe's Lakers lose the 2001 championship to the 76ers, so his championship ring count decreases to only 4, but other than that, his legacy stays pretty much the same. LeBron James. Nobody's legacy takes a bigger hit than LeBron's, as he goes down from 4 championship rings to only 1. Despite several losing efforts, he still likely secures 3 Finals MVPs in this circumstance, but even that is 1 less than what he currently has in our reality of a 7-game format. Wilt Chamberlain. Under this alternative universe, the legend of Wilt Chamberlain only grows, as both his championships and Finals MVPs increase to a total of 3, which would only earn him more respect within the GOAT conversation. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. Kareem gains several Finals MVPs, but he also loses 1 championship, which now leaves his count standing at 5-5 instead of 6-2. Bill Russell. Bill loses 3 championships from his total, one going to the St. Louis Hawks in 1957 and the others going to the Lakers in 66 and 69. It feels ridiculous to say this next part, but due to this, Bill Russell now has only 8 championships to his name. How will his legacy ever survive? Tim Duncan. Tim's resume only gets stronger as he now has 6 championship rings instead of 5 and 5 Finals MVPs instead of 3. Duncan is already in the GOAT conversation to many people, but under this one-and-done format, he's not just in the conversation, but he's at the very forefront of the debate. Magic Johnson. Magic and Bird are probably the least affected GOAT candidates. Yeah, Magic loses 2 Finals MVPs, but he still has 1 remaining, and his ring count stays the same at 5. Him and Bird are actually the only GOAT candidates whose ring counts don't change in either direction. Larry Bird. Larry's Celtics now lose the 1984 championship to the Lakers, but they also win the 1985 championship over the Lakers. So basically, a couple of championship outcomes change, but his ring count and legacy remains the same. Anyway, there's a lot more to take from this and consider, so again, the link to this project is in the pinned comment if you want to take a deeper look for yourself. I will say this, the NBA having a 7-game format usually results in the best healthy team actually winning the championship. But a one-and-done format allows underdogs to occasionally achieve the unexpected, like the 2008 Super Bowl for example, when the New York Giants defeated the 18-0 New England Patriots. I'm pretty sure the Patriots would have won that championship if it took place in a 7-game series, but since it was just a one-and-done, anything was possible. So what do you guys think? Is a one-and-done format something you would ever want to see in the NBA? Or is it best left for other sports? Let me know in the comment section below.
Y'all lost to the Pistons in 04. And by the way, them my big bros. I love them. I respect them. But like they scored 70 points a game. We would have mopped them.
You would have mopped them too?
They scored 70 points.
Let me see.
Would the 2017 Warriors beat the 2004 Pistons?
Y'all was barely winning.
We have an NBA record that will never be broken.
What's that?
When we kept, I think it was either 6 or 7 teams under 70 points in this scoring era.
Yeah, that never get broken.
That will never get broken again. We were defense. We hung our hat on defense. We would have beat the out of them. And I'm going to address that because Draymond said this bullshit.
Draymond killed you.
You crazy.
Man, you can't guard Draymond Green.
He said this bullshit the other day on him and Shaq's podcast. We would have beat the shit out of them because for the simple fact they couldn't match up with us at any position.
Alright, so today's video is not something that's breaking news or even something that many people would think warrants a video. It's just a fun topic of debate and something that I think is worth talking about and something that I really wanted to give my 2 cents on. So Draymond Green and Rasheed Wallace, two guys who are known for getting lots of technical fouls, albeit being incredible players as well, have been having this beef about which team would win, the 2017 Golden State Warriors or the 2004 Detroit Pistons. Just a quick recap on these two teams. The 2017 Golden State Warriors famously signed Kevin Durant in the prior offseason and then stormed through the regular season and especially stormed through the playoffs as they went 16-1 in those playoffs. Now on the other hand, you have the 2004 Detroit Pistons, who was a very defensively minded team, to put it lightly. A more accurate assessment of them is probably that they were the greatest defensive team of all time, or at the very least, they were in that conversation as they were regularly holding teams under 70 points. And famously, they put the clamps on the 2004 Los Angeles Lakers, who had Shaq, Kobe, Karl Malone, and Gary Payton. People act like that team wasn't a championship Lakers team, but the reality is they were on their way until they ran into that wall that was Detroit. Now you saw Rasheed Wallace's original take at the beginning of this video. Draymond Green actually responded to that on Twitter/X, whatever you want to call it. And he tweeted this: "Sheed, we would have smacked y'all. Y'all was scoring 72 points per game. That's not winning a half." Just to interject real quick, that is major cap, and we'll get into that. "And we putting you on them big ass forces in every pick and roll. Let's see how you move your feet. That one ring was great though, big bro." We all appreciated it. So obviously some great shade thrown in response. So here's the thing. You're talking about two totally different teams from two totally different eras. I will say the most frustrating part of this entire debate between Rasheed Wallace and Draymond Green is not one time did anyone bring up pace. Rasheed Wallace did bring up the physicality of the 2004 playoffs in comparison to 2017, but let's be honest, nothing affects the score of the game more than the pace of play. You could talk about physicality, defense, three-point shots in different eras. The reality is, if the game is at a snail's pace, it is going to dramatically affect the score of the game. And that was the case for the 2004 Pistons. Throughout the regular season, the 2017 Warriors actually averaged about 13 more possessions per game than the 2004 Pistons. But what's even crazier is that the Warriors actually picked up the pace in their playoff season, while things slowed down for the 2004 Pistons. Again, if the Warriors are getting 14 to 15 less opportunities to score on every single night, then of course scores are going to be dramatically affected. Regardless, Golden State is going to be nearly impossible to put the clamps on for just about any team. But these 04 Pistons were not just any other team. I actually think they matched up with Golden State quite well. Chauncey Billups was their starting point guard. He's going to be guarding Steph Curry, and Chauncey Billups was a two-time All-Defender. It's not a bad matchup. Richard Hamilton has a high IQ and he's good at coming off screens. He'll be a good candidate to guard Klay Thompson. I'm not saying they're shutting these guys down, I'm just saying that they'll do a decent job. And then a small forward for Golden State, you have Kevin Durant. And again, there's nobody that can stop Kevin Durant regularly. But I will say, when you're looking at the vast history of NBA defensive players, and especially wing defenders, one of the guys who stands out as a good candidate to contain Durant is actually Tayshaun Prince. He's 6 foot 9 inches tall with an incredibly long wingspan, and he was one of the best defensive players of his era. Very few players can match Durant with his length, and Tayshaun is one of the guys who actually can. Then you have Rasheed and Draymond guarding each other on the court, and I think we all can admit that would be highly entertaining, especially when you bring their antics and attitude into the equation. And then at center, you're going to have Zaza Pachulia and Ben Wallace. And especially when it comes to the boards and the defensive play, Ben Wallace is going to be eating him for lunch. Again, Warriors are threats all over the court. They have incredible scorers, they have incredible shooters. You're not just going to clamp these guys across the board. So trust me, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying Detroit's one of the teams that actually might be well suited to defend them, especially when you consider how they're arguably the greatest defensive team of all time. Draymond's tweet said they were scoring 72 points per game, and that's not true. Sure, there were some games where they scored 72 points, but they were actually averaging 87 in the playoffs. And again, that's still not much by today's modern standards. But when you look at less three-point shots and about 15 less possessions per game, it starts to make sense. Now, the one thing about the Pistons is they don't really have that advantage on the offensive end. That's why the 2001 Lakers always seem like the ideal matchup for the 2017 Warriors, because we all know Zaza Pachulia wouldn't stand a chance against a prime Shaq. Shaq's easily getting 40 points and 20 rebounds on every night. Because Ben Wallace is such a limited offensive player, they don't really have that advantage. So I think the most difficult part for Detroit is not slowing down the Warriors' offense, but it's just keeping up with their offense with their own. Now I gotta say, these guys are both very biased to the teams they played for, and that's rather obvious, you expect that. But neither guy is giving the other team enough respect. I always think it's funny when old heads act like they would mop these great modern teams when they didn't even mop the entire competition they were up against that year. The 04 Pistons are a great example of that. For goodness sake, they went to 7 games in the Eastern Conference semifinals that year against the New Jersey Nets. And again, as much as I love Jason Kidd, Kenyon Martin, and Richard Jefferson, they're not the 2017 Golden State Warriors. That series was up for grabs all the way up to the final game. And now you're trying to tell me that you're going to handle the Warriors in, say, 4 or 5 games? That's insane. It's the same thing whenever Kevin Garnett or any of the 08 Celtics go on about how they would just sweep through other all-time great teams. Like in your own playoff series in 2008, you went to 7 games with the Joe Johnson-led Atlanta Hawks, and then to 7 games with the Cleveland Cavaliers, who just had LeBron and a bunch of guys who weren't nearly on his level. So again, in order to earn that level of respect, in order to get into this conversation where you could just say, oh, our team would just sweep that other team, we'd whop them in 4 or 5 games. You gotta at least have handled your own competition in that era to that extent. Otherwise, you just look ridiculous. And in this case, Rasheed Wallace does look that ridiculous. Ultimately, in a hypothetical series like this, I think the Warriors win in about 6 games. I'm just saying that I think Detroit could do a better job containing them than they're given credit for, especially when you understand the context of the pace of play and how the game was played. The problem, and where Golden State is really going to take advantage, is the Pistons don't have any major offensive advantages. If they were stronger at the center position, then yeah, they could take advantage of Zaza. That's where other great teams like the 94 Rockets, the 2001 Lakers, the 1983 Philadelphia 76ers, or other teams like that would have a major advantage, because they have those all-time great bigs to take advantage of that matchup, and Detroit doesn't bolster that. Personally, this is just 2 highly emotional guys who are very emotionally attached to their teams and therefore really biased, making some ridiculous points and not giving each other enough respect. But to be real with you, I do think it would be a great series, and I wish I could see it.
The Dream Team and the Redeem Team, the 2 greatest basketball teams ever assembled. Both teams were loaded with Hall of Famers and driven with motivation. When the 1992 Dream Team was assembled, it marked the first time in U.S. Olympic history that the USA team would be represented by NBA players. They were coming off of the 1988 Olympics, in which the USA team only managed a bronze medal. The new professional Olympians were ready to dominate the rest of the world as basically the Avengers of the basketball universe, and dominate is exactly what they did. On their way to the gold medal, the US crushed every single opponent by at least 32 points. At the time, they were without question the greatest basketball team ever assembled. As the years have gone on, the game has become an obsession on a more global scale, and the rest of the world has been improving on its abilities. This was never more evident than in the 2004 Olympics, when the USA men's basketball team only managed a bronze medal as Argentina secured the gold. This motivated the men's US program to have a new level of focus and determination heading into the 2008 Olympics. Coach Mike Krzyzewski stepped in, and the world's best players joined together to form the Redeem Team. The Redeem team steamrolled the competition on their way to the gold, winning their games by an average disparity of 28 points. Both USA teams destroyed the competition, and never before or since has there been teams assembled as powerful as these two squads. On the Dream Team was Michael Jordan, Larry Bird, Magic Johnson, Scottie Pippen, Clyde Drexler, Charles Barkley, David Robinson, Patrick Ewing, Chris Mullin, Karl Malone, and John Stockton. Technically, Christian Laettner was on the team too, but he won't be much of a determining factor. On the Redeem team was Kobe Bryant, LeBron James, Dwayne Wade, Carmelo Anthony, Dwight Howard, Chris Bosh, Jason Kidd, Chris Paul, Carlos Boozer, Darren Williams, Tayshaun Prince, and Michael Redd. Mike Gorzemba did his own video on this comparison, but in it, he let the NBA 2K simulation be the determining factor. In this video, I'll be taking more of an analytical approach, and by the end of this, we'll determine who would win this matchup. We'll be looking at all kinds of different factors, from how the international game is played to the different matchups on the floor. So without any further ado, let's get into it. First off, let's take a look at the talent at the very top of the roster for both teams, starting with the three best players. The Dream Team is obviously loaded with talent and all-time greats, but when you think about the best they have to offer, three players come to mind: Michael, Magic, and Larry. These three were responsible for carrying the NBA throughout the 80s and 90s, and each one of these guys are easily in the top 10 greatest players of all time. With all of that being said, timing is a huge factor in this comparison. At the time the Dream Team was assembled, these three players were not all in the prime of their careers. Sure, Michael Jordan was a back-to-back NBA champion. He was arguably the best player on both sides of the ball, and was in the middle of building his argument as the greatest player of all time. Magic and Larry, on the other hand, were completely different stories. Magic Johnson had already retired from the NBA due to his HIV announcement, and had previously missed an entire season of basketball before lacing them up again for the '92 Olympics. Although this Magic Johnson was still solid, this wasn't the prime shape Magic Johnson of the mid-'80s who was winning championships and MVP awards. Larry was in a much worse state. Bird, along with Magic, had also retired from the NBA and was 35 years old at the time, dealing with severe and chronic back problems. You could often find Larry laying courtside to deal with the back pain. He played in very limited minutes throughout the Olympic Games, and the only players he outscored were the two pass-first point guards, Magic Johnson and John Stockton, and of course the college kid, Christian Laettner, who honestly didn't do much of anything for the Dream Team. So essentially you had a prime Michael Jordan, a Magic Johnson a little beyond his years, and a Larry Bird who was a complete shell of what he once was. Now compare that to the three best players of the Redeem Team: Kobe Bryant, LeBron James, and Dwayne Wade. Kobe was at the height of his powers, coming off of an MVP season and a trip to the finals in which he had recently lost to the Boston Celtics. This was one of the most competitively driven and motivated version of Kobe the league had seen, and players testified that it showed in his workouts and preparations for those summer games. LeBron was still young and maturing, but athletically speaking, this was the prime of his career. Dwayne Wade was also in his prime and actually led the entire Redeem Team in scoring over the summer games. All three of these legends were in their mid to late 20s, which is a stark contrast from the Dream Team's stars. The greatest and glaring mismatch would be at the small forward position. A quick, strong, and physically primed 24-year-old LeBron James would be a near impossible task for the back injury-laden 35-year-old Larry Bird to handle. In Larry Bird's prime, he was a good defender, but the 1992 version of Bird was far from his prime form. Larry would be slow defensively during their games and would spend a majority of the match laying on the sideline to deal with the back pain. To put it simply, LeBron would have an absolute feast in this contest whenever Larry was on the floor across from him. Regardless of Jordan's greatness, the edge in this aspect goes to the Redeem Team. As you go deeper into the rosters, you begin to notice an advantage for the Dream Team, and that's the big men. Sure, the Redeem Team has Dwight Howard, who is at the height of his powers as well. He was a top 5 player in the league at this point, and he was an anchor defensively, but with that being said, he doesn't have much help in the paint with only Chris Bosh and Carlos Boozer to back him up, and he'll have the responsibility of containing David Robinson, Patrick Ewing, Karl Malone, and Charles Barkley. That's just too much firepower in the paint and in the post for the Dream Team to not give them an overwhelming advantage in this area. Dwight will do the best he can do to contest shots and handle all that physicality down low, but those Dream Team players are some of the greatest centers and power forwards in NBA history who were accustomed to bullying opponents around with their strength and physicality, and they'll be owning the rebounding battle as well. Speaking of physicality, this is an area where the international game is quite different from the NBA style of play and officiating. Teams are allowed to play a more physical style of basketball in international basketball. The refereeing is just far more lenient. More contact is allowed and less reach-in fouls are called. Notably, this was a particular advantage that Kobe Bryant used in the 2008 Olympic Games. Kobe took on the assignment of guarding the opposing best player night in and night out, and he was clearly a frustration to opposing players with his new level of physical intensity being permitted. So since Kobe used this to his advantage, you might think that this is an advantage that works towards the benefit of the Redeem Team, but I actually think this physicality would more strongly benefit the '92 Dream Team. Jordan and Pippen are two of the greatest wing defenders in NBA history. With their strength, length, and giant hands, they would cause all kinds of problems for the Redeem Team. John Stockton was a feisty defensive point guard as well, who is also the all-time leader in steals. He would greatly benefit from the more lenient play as well. Obviously, the Redeem Team could also ramp up their defensive intensity too, but with Jordan and Pippen already suffocating you defensively, the last thing they need is more leniency to rough you up on the perimeter. This is an aspect and advantage that's in favor of the Dream Team. On the other side of the spectrum from the physicality is the perimeter shooting and the three-point revolution that's taken the NBA by storm. The 2008 team was better at the three ball, which matters significantly, especially when you consider that the three-point line is closer in international play. In the Olympic Games, the three-point line is only 20 feet 6 inches away from the basket. That's closer to college ball distance than the NBA. The NBA is at 22 feet on the corners and 23 feet 9 inches from the top of the arc. The long, inefficient two-point shots are now just close three-pointers in the Olympics, which is why guys like Carmelo Anthony, who aren't typically great three-point shooters, suddenly look like some of the greatest three-point shooters ever in the Olympics. Kobe also becomes a fantastic three-point shooter since he too is a lover of the long two-point jumpers. With shooters like Melo, Kobe, Chris Paul, Michael Redd, and Deron Williams, the Redeem Team has the advantage in this area, but it's not quite as clear as some of you might initially think. The Dream Team have shooters like Chris Mullin, Clyde Drexler, and Larry Bird. The shorter three-point line also makes Michael Jordan a viable three-point option as well. In the '92 Olympics, Jordan and Mullin together actually shot more three-pointers than the rest of the Dream Team combined. So again, although the Redeem Team has an edge on perimeter shooting, the Dream Team can certainly hang. The last aspect I'll touch on is the overall depth for each team and how the second units match up. Based on health and talent, you're likely looking at a Dream Team starting lineup of Magic, Jordan, Pippen, Barkley, and Robinson going up against Chris Paul, Kobe, LeBron, Carmelo, and Dwight Howard. That's a pretty solid 5-on-5. But once players rest and the rotation players come in, that's where the depth of the Dream Team begins to become overwhelming. The Dream Team's second unit looks like John Stockton, Clyde Drexler, Larry Bird, Karl Malone, and Patrick Ewing. That's their freaking bench mob. That second group has defense, experience, shooting, IQ, and rebounding. They really aren't missing much. They would be up against the second unit of Deron Williams, Dwayne Wade, Tayshaun Prince, Carlos Boozer, and Chris Bosh. Other than Wade and maybe Bosh, this second unit would get absolutely destroyed by the Dream Team's second unit. And when the Redeem Team starters head to the bench, that's when they would start to fall behind. After you consider the main factors, from the star players, the defense, physicality, shooting, and depth, I would pick the Dream Team's 11 Hall of Famers to prevail over the Redeem Team's 8 future Hall of Famers. In a single game, I'm picking them to win in an 8 to 12 point victory, and in a best of 7, I'm taking the Dream Team in 6. Again, I have my analytical notes, but this is all just speculation in my opinion. Who knows, maybe the Redeem team would surprise me in this hypothetical situation. Let me know in the comments section who you think would win in a 7-game series and how many games it would take.
So on my channel, I'm closing in on 200,000 subscribers, which means that I'm getting my video ready to answer 200 questions from my subscribers. One of the questions that I received over and over again is which team was the greatest basketball team of all time if every player on the roster was in their prime. Seeing that this was a really fun question and that I really needed time to flesh out my thoughts, I figured I'd give this one its own individual video. So these are the top 16 teams in NBA history, in my opinion, if all the players involved were in their prime. The reason I picked 16 is pretty simple, because at some point I might like to run a playoff simulation in NBA 2K. Let me know and me and my editor will get it ready. Starting off with number 16, the 06 to 07 Miami Heat. The hypothetical starting lineup would be Gary Payton, who was a Defensive Player of the Year winner and a 20 points per game scorer in his prime. You have Dwayne Wade, who was a great defensive player as well and a 30 points per game scorer. You had Eddie Jones, who was a perennial all-star, Antoine Walker, who was a great 3-point shooter and a scorer in his own right, and you have a prime Shaquille O'Neal, who was the most dominant player in modern NBA history. Some of the noteworthy players who would be coming off the bench would be Alonzo Mourning, who was an elite two-way player in his own right, and Jason Williams, who was a solid playmaker and a highlight machine. Number 15, the 2021 to 2022 Los Angeles Lakers. It's hard to say whether or not these guys would have on-court chemistry if they all were in their primes, but without question, they would be incredibly talented. You have Russell Westbrook in his triple-double 30 points per game form. You have Carmelo Anthony, probably from his days as a Denver Nugget. You have LeBron James, who is going to be in his impressive 2013 Miami form. Then there's Anthony Davis and Dwight Howard, which will make them one of the greatest interior defenses of all time. That's just the starting unit. Coming off the bench would be a prime Rajon Rondo, Isaiah Thomas, DeAndre Jordan, and Trevor Ariza. Number 14, the 98 to 99 Los Angeles Lakers. The starting lineup would be Derek Fisher, Kobe Bryant, Glenn Rice, Dennis Rodman, and Shaquille O'Neal. Some of the more noteworthy players to come off the bench would be one of the most clutch shooters of all time, Robert Horry, Eddie Jones, and Eldon Campbell. Number 13, the 1979 to 1980 Boston Celtics. The starting lineup would be Nate Tiny Archibald, Pistol Pete Maravich, Cedric Cornbread Maxwell, Larry Bird, and Dave Cowens. 4 of these guys were either MVP winners or MVP finalists. The only guy who wasn't was Cedric Maxwell, but he was also a Finals MVP winner. One of the more noteworthy players to come off the bench would be ML Carr. Number 12, the 2012 to 2013 Los Angeles Lakers. At that point in time, Steve Nash was nowhere close to his prime, as he was approaching the age of 40 and was having plenty of back problems. But this time, he'd be the floor general in his peak form. Alongside of him would be a peak Kobe Bryant, Ron Artest in his Defensive Player of the Year form in Indiana, and Dwight Howard, who would be just as good as he was in Orlando well before the back surgery. One of the more noteworthy players to come off the bench would be Anton Jamison, who was one of the best scorers in the league during the early 2000s. Number 11, the 1985 to 1986 Boston Celtics. The starting lineup would be Danny Ainge, Dennis Johnson, Larry Bird, Kevin McHale, and instead of Robert Parrish, it would be a prime Bill Walton. It's also worth considering that Dennis Johnson gets a significant boost as he would be in his Finals MVP form from his Seattle Supersonics days. Robert Parrish is obviously the one coming off the bench, as he was a great defensive player and a 20 points per game scorer. Number 10, the 17 to 18 Cleveland Cavaliers. Starting at point guard would be Derrick Rose, who would be in his young MVP form. Then you have Dwayne Wade, LeBron James, and Kevin Love. And people forget that Love was one of the league's top scorers and the game's top rebounder while he was in Minnesota. Tristan Thompson finishes out the starting five. Some of the noteworthy players to come off the bench would be Kyle Korver and J.R. Smith. Number 9, the 1971-1972 Los Angeles Lakers. This is the team that famously won an NBA record 33 straight regular season games, and won 69 games in total before they went on to win the NBA championship. With that being said, most of the players involved were not in their prime. Jerry West was as good as ever, and so was Gil Goodrich. But at the 3 spot, this was the final season of Elgin Baylor's career, and he didn't even make it through the first half of the regular season. Then you have Happy Hairston, and now a prime Wilt Chamberlain, who was in his 1962 50 points and 25 rebounds per game form. One of the noteworthy players to come off the bench was Jim McMillan. Number 8, the 2012-2013 Miami Heat. The starting 5 would be Mario Chalmers, Dwayne Wade, Ray Allen, LeBron James, and Chris Bosh. You gotta remember, this team won 27 straight regular season games, but guys like Bosh and Wade had already taken a significant step back. The only guy that was actually in his prime was LeBron James. But now, you're getting a Ray Allen who was capable of averaging 25 points per game, and who was even an above-the-rim player. Without question, Ray Allen being in his peak form is the greatest upgrade for this squad. Some of the noteworthy players to come off the bench would be a peak Rashard Lewis, who was a great scorer and an all-time great three-point shooter, Shane Battier, who was a fantastic defensive player, and Mike Miller, who was a solid three-point shooter. Number 7, the 2012-2013 San Antonio Spurs. You would have Tony Parker in his finals MVP form, and then you would have a peak Tracy McGrady, who would be just as good as he was in Orlando in the early 2000s. Then you have Kawhi Leonard, who would be in his 2019 Toronto Raptors form, Boris Diaw at the power forward, and Tim Duncan at the 5. Some of the more noteworthy players to come off the bench would be Manu Ginobili, Danny Green, and a 20 points per game scorer in Steven Jackson. Number 6, the 1985-1986 Philadelphia 76ers. One of the best playmakers and pickpockets of the era was Maurice Cheeks, and alongside of him would be a fantastic scorer in Andrew Toney. At small forward would be Julius Erving. The power forward would be an MVP form Charles Barkley, and the starting center is one of the most underrated players of all time, the 30 points and 15 rebounds per game Moses Malone. Coming off the bench would be one of the greatest scorers in NBA history, who averaged as high as 34 points per game in the 1970s, and his name is Bob McAdoo, who was also an MVP winner. Another bench player would be the Secretary of Defense Bobby Jones, who was simply one of the greatest defensive players of all time. Number 5, the 1984-1985 Los Angeles Lakers. Now picture the Showtime Lakers in all of their glory, but instead of just Kareem Abdul-Jabbar being in his usual Showtime form, he is even better, as he is as good as he was on the Milwaukee Bucks in the early 1970s. The starting 5 would be Magic Johnson, Byron Scott, James Worthy, Bob McAdoo in his 34 points per game form, and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. Coming off the bench would be an NBA Hall of Famer Jamal Wilkes, and one of the greatest role players and 3-and-D players of all time, Michael Cooper. Number 4, the 2010-2011 Boston Celtics. Obviously, they would have all the great attributes that they had of the team that won the championship in 2008. But Paul Pierce is better because now he's in his early 2000s prime form. Kevin Garnett is in his Minnesota Timberwolves 2004 MVP form. Ray Allen is much better as he's in his 25 points per game form. And even Rajon Rondo is now in his 2012 form instead of 2008. This team instantly becomes so much better. And oh yeah, starting at the center, is now the most dominant player in modern history, Shaquille O'Neal. Coming off the bench would be one of the guys who was one of the best bigs in the Eastern Conference for a short period of time, and that's Jermaine O'Neal. Number 3. The 2003 to 2004 Los Angeles Lakers. This is a team that went all the way to the NBA Finals in 2004, but consider the fact that none of these guys were in their prime. Gary Payton was in the twilight of his career, and was nowhere close to his 1996 form where he was the Defensive Player of the Year. Kobe Bryant wasn't himself as he was dealing with the Colorado trials. Then there's Rick Fox as small forward. Starting at power forward would be Karl Malone, but this time in his peak form from the 1990s, and Shaquille O'Neal, who would be in his peak shape from the 99 to 2000 season. Some of the noteworthy players to come off the bench would be Derek Fisher and a prime Horace Grant, who would be just as good as he was in the early 90s with the Chicago Bulls. Number 2. The 2018 to 2019 Golden State Warriors. The starting lineup would be Steph Curry, Klay Thompson, Kevin Durant, Draymond Green, and DeMarcus Cousins. Essentially, you have the 2017 Golden State Warriors, but instead of Zaza Pachulia in the 5 spot, you have a prime DeMarcus Cousins, who was a great scorer, a solid rebounder, and one of the best passing bigs at his peak. A couple noteworthy players to come off the bench would be Andre Iguodala, and this was a much better Iggy, as he would be in his extremely athletic Philadelphia 76ers form. And the other noteworthy bench player is a prime Andrew Bogut. Number 1. The 96 to 97 Chicago Bulls. Now picture all of the glory of the 95 to 96 Bulls, who won an NBA record at the time 72 games, on their way to the NBA championship. To this day, that's the most regular season games won by a team that won the championship. But what's crazy is that none of those players were in their prime. Think about it. Even Michael Jordan was much better in his first three-peat, both athletically and statistically. Scottie Pippen had his career year 2 years prior. Dennis Rodman was much younger, much more athletic, and had better rebounding numbers in the early 90s. And even Ron Harper, who would be the starting point guard, wasn't in the same form that he once was with the Clippers and the Cleveland Cavaliers, where he was an athletic player who was a 20 points per game scorer. But instead of Luke Longley, starting at the 5 would be Robert Parrish, an all-time great big, a solid defensive player, and a 20 points per game scorer. Then coming off the bench, you'd have Tony Kukoc and Steve Kerr. This team would have everything. They'd have the scoring, they'd have the defense, both on the interior and on the perimeter. They had rebounding, they had chemistry, and not only did they have the greatest player of all time, but likely the greatest coach of all time as well. And that's why this incredibly upgraded version of the 90s Bulls is my choice as the greatest team of all time in this ridiculously hypothetical scenario. So what do you guys think? Do you agree with the list? I gotta be honest, I changed my mind about 15 times while I was making this list. So if yours is different than mine, I won't hold it against you, but I'd like to hear about it in the comment section below. LeBron James is one of the most talented and athletically gifted players in the history of the league. He's a 4-time NBA champion, a 4-time MVP, he's a 20-time All-Star, and he's the NBA's all-time leading scorer. On top of that, he's one of the most polarizing athletes in the history of sports. And the biggest reason for that is all the various decisions that he's made throughout his long playing career. He started his career in Cleveland, then made a stop in Miami, then returned to Cleveland, and is now currently with the Los Angeles Lakers. The thing about LeBron is that he's changed jerseys so many times that it leads us to imagine how would his career and how would basketball history change if he approached some of those situations differently. If I'm being honest, I think LeBron James made a mistake. Twice. The first mistake takes us all the way back to the 2009 to 2010 season. Approaching was that summer, which was one of the most highly anticipated basketball summers of all time, as LeBron James was going to become a free agent. Many people believed that he was going to stay in Cleveland where his heart was. But at the same time, one of the most tempting and alluring destinations was New York. And LeBron wasn't helping Cleveland fans feel any more comfortable. For goodness sake, he showed up to a Cleveland Indians game in a New York Yankees hat. And then, after dropping more than 50 points against the New York Knicks, he said that Madison Square Garden was his favorite place to play basketball. All of this seemed to foreshadow a future where LeBron would be playing in a blue and orange jersey. But you all know what happened. In the summer of 2010, he took his talents to South Beach to play alongside of Dwayne Wade and Chris Bosh. The thing is, Miami wasn't the only organization that had plenty of cap space. Chicago was one of the teams that were in the market, as were the New York Knicks. Now, my opinion on this first quote mistake is definitely the more controversial one, but I think LeBron should have gone to the New York Knicks in the summer of 2010. Yes, he won 2 championships with Dwayne Wade and Chris Bosh, but if he had gone to the New York Knicks, they still could have freed up cap space to potentially get another superstar player, whether it was Carmelo Anthony or even Wade or Bosh. LeBron would have had a lot of control over that struggling organization during the prime of his career. Between 2011 and 2014 was when James was at his absolute peak, not just offensively, but defensively as well. And I truly believed that if they would have surrounded him with a solid supporting cast, that he would have won a championship in the Big Apple as well. And that would have meant so much more. New York City is way more passionate about their basketball than Miami. Year in and year out, they have one of the most committed fan bases in all of the NBA, despite the fact that they haven't won an NBA championship since 1973. To say that this organization is desperate for championship success would be a monumental understatement. Winning in Miami is one thing, but they're a team who is usually pretty competitive, and they had just won the championship with Wade and Shaquille O'Neal in 2006. But if LeBron had won a championship in New York, where most Knicks fans were not even alive to witness their most recent championship, then James would be seen as an absolute hero. Just one championship in the Big Apple would solidify him as one of the most memorable and eternal figures in Knicks history. So LeBron didn't do that, and I saw that as a missed opportunity, even back when this whole thing first happened. He won 2 championships in 4 seasons in Miami, he returned to Cleveland and won the championship in 2016, and I believe that was his most impressive championship by far, and then he joined my Los Angeles Lakers in 2018. Once again, heading into the summer of 2018, LeBron was rumored to be connected with several different organizations, and the New York Knicks was one of them. Even more so than in 2010, I do believe LeBron should have gone to the Knicks in 2018, and I fully understand that New York Knicks fans are going to hate me talking about this, because at this point, they've been scorned by LeBron to the point that they detest him. He flirted with them time and time again, and after being rejected by him twice after he led them on, they want nothing to do with him. But there was a time where this could have worked. Now listen. When LeBron joined my Lakers, I understood that he wasn't going to be immediately embraced by all the different Kobe Bryant fans. This city is used to a superstar player who is the ultimate competitor and who is a guy who will shoot his way into an NBA championship. When it comes down to the final shot, 99 times out of 100, Kobe's shooting it, when LeBron prefers to kick it to the open guy. Fundamentally and idealistically, LeBron and Kobe are 2 completely different basketball players. So again, I knew he was going to be hard to warm up to for Los Angeles. But in 2018, I claimed that if LeBron James won a championship in Los Angeles, that would become the day that he was officially embraced by Lakers fans. And boy, was I wrong. So just a few days ago, I did a poll on this channel, and the results were extremely revealing. It was concerning LeBron James' likability amongst Lakers fans and non-Lakers fans. And here are the stunning results. Not only are Laker fans split on how likable LeBron James is, but you also have to consider the fact that a greater ratio of people like LeBron James in the general basketball crowd, more so than the crowd of the team that he's currently playing for. That is insane. Along with that, you also have to consider the fact that LeBron is getting a boost in this poll from Laker fans who only became Laker fans when LeBron came over. If this poll was specifically aimed at people who are pre-existing Laker fans before LeBron, then this breakdown would look even worse for him. My point is that the Lakers fandom hasn't embraced him even after the 2020 NBA championship. If I ask this same question to Laker fans regarding Kobe Bryant, what do you think the poll numbers would be then? This is why I believe LeBron's greatest mistake was turning down the Knicks a second time. Again, it ties into everything I said earlier. If he had led the Knicks to win an NBA championship alongside of Anthony Davis instead of the Lakers, then he would have been immortalized in Knicks lore and been loved almost universally by New York fans. But the Lakers have Kobe fans. The Lakers have a rich history of championships. The Lakers have done a lot of winning since 1973. So what I'm essentially saying is this was a match made in hell. Could LeBron have won the championship with the Knicks? I don't know. Many Knicks fans are going to raise the point that they've had poor management for many years. But I would argue that so have the Lakers ever since Jerry Buss passed away. I think LeBron is good enough, and good enough at recruiting fellow star talent, to win a championship despite the fact that they're poorly managed. It's not just whether you win or you lose. It's how you win and lose that affects how you're remembered. Today's video is about one of the most highly discussed basketball theories in NBA history. Would the Chicago Bulls have won the championship in 1994 and eventually in 1995 if Michael Jordan had never retired in the summer of 1993? He left the game he loved to go play another game he loved, baseball, fulfilling his father's dream after his tragic passing. The thing is, there's a lot of things at play with this hypothetical situation that a lot of people usually don't consider, and today I wanted to tackle some of those aspects. Now, one thing is for certain, who the Bulls would have been going up against in the NBA Finals if they theoretically made it in 1994 and 1995 wouldn't have changed, as Hakeem Olajuwon's Rockets were the back-to-back NBA champions coming out of the Western Conference. Seeing that the Bulls are an Eastern Conference team, they wouldn't have seen them until the NBA Finals. Therefore, Houston's trajectory certainly wouldn't have changed, at least until that point. Now, before we get into this hypothetical situation, we first have to look at what the Bulls lineup looked like when Michael Jordan was retired. The first season after Jordan had retired was actually a really impressive year for Chicago. They made several acquisitions, as they had signed the perimeter shooting assassin Steve Kerr. They signed the versatile small forward Tony Kukoc to an 8-year deal, and they signed Bill Wennington to be a backup center. This team was extremely deep, as it had much of the supporting cast of the Bulls' first three-peat, and it had some of the quality pieces of their second three-peat. Due to the fact that this team was well coached by Phil Jackson, Scottie Pippen had a career year, and they were extremely deep, they won 55 games in that regular season, and made it all the way to Game 7 of the Eastern Conference semifinals before they were controversially eliminated by the New York Knicks. Their 93-94 season was certainly better than their 94-95 season, as their second year after Jordan's departure was a lot more tumultuous, as there was chemistry issues, execution issues, and there was the lack of Horace Grant, who had left in the offseason and had signed with an Eastern Conference contender in the Orlando Magic. Due to this, Chicago was really struggling up until Jordan returned with 17 games left in the regular season. As most of you all know, Michael Jordan did help his Bulls to make it into the playoffs before they were eventually eliminated by Shaq, Penny, Horace Grant, and the Orlando Magic. One of the most common narratives about this season is that Michael Jordan wasn't yet back into basketball shape. Even in the Last Dance documentary, Michael Jordan and his physical trainer talked about how he was still in baseball shape. He hadn't quite got rid of his baseball body and got back into his basketball form, and because of that, he wasn't quite at 100% just yet. Do I agree with that narrative? Yes, to a certain extent. Jordan was definitely a little bit rusty, but with that being said, he was still a monster in those playoffs, even if you include the fact that they lost. Yes, he did have that iconic moment where he made a crucial turnover when things mattered the most. But after that point, Jordan was still efficiently averaging around 30 points per game while filling up the stat sheet and playing great defense. So although MJ was not at 100%, I do think it's a little overblown at times about the quality of shape he was in and about how well he performed. Again, one of the biggest issues for that 1995 team was their lack of an inside presence. With the absence of Horace Grant, who was now on the opposing side of the court, the Bulls really struggled with interior defense and with interior rebounding. And that was an aspect that Shaq and Grant took full advantage of. But let's refocus and look back at 1994. The Bulls were coming off of their first three-peat. And yes, Jordan was extremely tired after that three-peat. But with an opportunity to win 4 straight, and with some recent acquisitions, I think they would have been well equipped to do so. This is one of the aspects that people almost never talk about. If Michael Jordan had been on the 93 to 94 team, that would have probably been the deepest Chicago Bulls team that they had ever had. Think about it. They would have had Michael Jordan, Scottie Pippen, and Horace Grant. But they also had a sharpshooter in B.J. Armstrong, who was one of the best snipers in the entire league and who was in his final season with the team. And then they had also acquired another great sniper who ended up being one of the most efficient three-point shooters in NBA history, which was Steve Kerr. And then they added Tony Kukoc, who was one of the greatest sixth men in NBA history and who was a versatile and long small forward / power forward, who could also do some perimeter shooting of his own. Again, there's a reason why this team was able to win 55 games without Michael Jordan and was able to compete with some of the best teams in the entire league. Also consider the fact that Scottie Pippen was in the very prime of his career. Now I gotta mention, some people in the comments might try to point out that the Bulls might not have been able to acquire Steve Kerr, Bill Wennington, and Tony Kukoc if Michael Jordan was still on the roster. But I actually disagree with that, because in the 94 to 93 season, Jordan was still technically on the Bulls' payroll, as he was making $4 million, which made him the 5th highest paid player in the NBA. You heard that correctly, Michael Jordan was a top 5 paid player in the NBA, even while he was playing baseball. So from a salary cap standpoint, nothing really changes. There's no reason why Jordan being on the roster would have hindered the Bulls' chances of acquiring Kukoc, Kerr, and Wennington. If MJ was on this extremely talented squad, I have no question that they would have won in the high 60s or possibly even 70 games with this group. I'm also confident that they would have steamrolled through the Eastern Conference. As always, New York would have been a little bit of a battle, but they went to 7 games with the Chicago Bulls without Michael Jordan. Now, as you all know, the Houston Rockets, led by Hakeem Olajuwon, would be waiting in the NBA Finals. And historically, that was one of the toughest matchups for the Chicago Bulls. Between the years of 1991 and 1993, Houston dominated Chicago in the regular season. Even Michael Jordan has spoken in the past about how Hakeem Olajuwon was one of their toughest matchups, as guys like Bill Cartwright didn't have a chance going up against the Dream. Anybody who knows basketball firmly believes that the Dream would have got his and would have put up monstrous numbers in this series. But the thing is, I don't know if that's enough to make up for everything else. As an out-of-conference matchup, the Bulls and the Rockets went up against each other twice in that 1994 regular season, and the Bulls actually split the series with the Rockets, as each team won a relatively close game. It was already pretty competitive, but if you give Michael Jordan in the prime of his career a prime Scottie Pippen, a still strong Horace Grant, and the best and deepest supporting cast that he's ever had, then I have very little doubt in my mind that the Bulls would end up winning their 4th straight championship. I think they would have been heavy favorites in that series, and personally, that's what I would have put my money on with confidence. So yes, if MJ had not left to play baseball, I believe he'd have at least 7 NBA championships, and would have completed a historic four-peat where he had defeated Hakeem Olajuwon and the Houston Rockets. But the thing is, things get a lot more interesting in 1995. Because in that offseason, Horace Grant had left the Chicago Bulls for the Orlando Magic. And again, we saw what happened in reality when Jordan rejoined the Bulls with 17 games left in the regular season. Some Bulls fans might suggest that Horace Grant would have stuck around if he had just won his fourth straight championship. And although that makes sense, money was a big factor in that decision for Grant. None of us can say for certain, outside of Horace, whether or not he actually would have left the Bulls if Jordan was still around. But seeing that Orlando made Grant one of the highest paid players in the NBA, I think it's fair for us just to assume for this video that he still ends up leaving the Bulls, which again leaves Chicago very lacking in the interior. Houston had also made a major acquisition, as they had acquired Clyde Drexler from the Portland Trail Blazers to help them try to win their second straight championship. Now here's something people need to remember. The Houston Rockets in 1995 had won their second straight championship in reality, but they were not this juggernaut type team. They actually had an underwhelming regular season, as they finished that year with 47 wins and 35 losses. And then, even in the postseason, they had to fight tooth and nail just to make it all the way to the NBA Finals. In the first round against the Utah Jazz, they defeated Utah 3-2. And then in the Western Conference semifinals against the Phoenix Suns, they barely won that series in 7 games. And then in the Western Conference Finals, in a tough battle against David Robinson, they ended up winning in 6 games. Yes, they swept the Orlando Magic in 4 games in the 1995 NBA Finals, and that is the iconic series that everybody remembers. But before that, every other series was basically a really tough match that they were barely able to overcome. But again, Chicago wasn't at full strength either. Remember, the Bulls don't have Horace Grant. They hadn't acquired Dennis Rodman until the following year, basically meaning they have no strong power forward position. And then at the center position, they're also weak in 1995, as Bill Cartwright was no longer with the team, meaning that the Bulls had a center rotation of Will Perdue and Bill Wennington. Neither of those guys are incredible players on offense or defense, and Hakeem Olajuwon would have ate them alive in 1995. As great as Jordan would have been, and as great as Pippen would have been, they had some serious holes that could be exploited. They would have lost the battle of the boards, both offensively and defensively, and as far as rim protection and points in the paint, it wouldn't have been even close. Due to this, I honestly believe that even if Michael Jordan had never retired and had been around for the full season in 1995, they still would have lost to Hakeem Olajuwon and the Houston Rockets in the 1995 NBA Finals. Again, we're talking about Michael Jordan, and in reality, he has a perfect undefeated record in the NBA Finals, so you can never count him out. But if you ask me, if he had never retired in the summer of 1993, I think he ends up with 7 championship rings instead of 6. He would have won 7 championships in the span of 8 seasons, assuming that Horace Grant still leaves in 1994, and Dennis Rodman still joins in the summer of 1995. But that's just my opinion based on the information we have and based on the matchups. After the Bulls won their 6th championship ring in 1998, the team imploded due to turmoil between the general manager, the coaches, and the players. Most basketball fans know the details about why this team disbanded, and if you watched the Last Dance documentary that released a few years ago, then you certainly know all about it. But if you don't know the details, you can watch my summarized version with this video. Now, towards the end of that documentary, Michael Jordan talked about how frustrated he was that his Bulls didn't get a chance to win a 7th championship ring in 1999. Phil Jackson retired due to pressure from general manager Jerry Krause. Without Phil Jackson around, Jordan decided to retire from basketball. Without Jordan around, Bulls management determined that they couldn't compete for championships, so they traded Scottie Pippen and Steve Kerr, and they released Dennis Rodman. Jordan was convinced that if Phil Jackson hadn't been pushed out of his coaching position, that entire squad would have returned for a chance to compete for a 7th ring in 1999, and he believed they likely would have won another championship. But is he right? Would the Bulls have won a 4th straight title to close out their dynasty on an even more legendary note? Well, I actually believe this answer is a bit more complicated than people usually recognize. There's a lot of nuance to this hypothetical question, and although there is absolutely no way we can get a definitive answer to something that never happened, at the very least, I can make an educated guess based on the information in front of us. So without further ado, let's get into it. The first thing we have to do is look at the state of the Chicago Bulls team at the end of the 1998 season. We'll start with Michael Jordan. MJ was 35 years old and had just finished his 13th season in the NBA. Jordan would have turned 36 during the 1998 to 1999 regular season. Now in those 98 finals against Utah, Jordan was extremely tired as he had just led the Bulls to their 3rd straight deep postseason run. Although MJ was quickly approaching his late 30s, he believed he was at his very peak of his basketball abilities, at least from the perspective of his basketball IQ, and in his ability to execute what he wanted. Regardless of the fact that it was his final season in Chicago, he was the league MVP, he was the league's leading scorer, he was first team all-defense, he was the All-Star Game MVP, and he was the Finals MVP. So in a sense, MJ might have been correct about this being his peak. Now Michael Jordan was certainly exhausted at the end of these NBA Finals, but that wasn't just because he was much older at this point in his career, but it had a lot to do with the fact that he had to take on a greater load throughout that season than usual. Scottie Pippen was recovering from surgery throughout the 1998 regular season, which meant that Jordan had to play more minutes and utilize more energy in order to win 60 basketball games. In those NBA Finals, Scottie Pippen was dealing with back pain, which caused MJ to have to carry the Bulls team offensively to an even greater extent, as he averaged 33 of the Bulls' 88 points in that final series. So although MJ was understandably very exhausted, I don't see that as an indication that he didn't have much left in the tank for 1999, but rather I saw that as a symptom of his extremely unique situation throughout the 1998 regular season. In my opinion, Jordan would have been his usual dominant self in the 1999 season, and was certainly up to the task of winning a 7th ring. So now let's look at Scottie Pippen. Obviously, Scottie was mostly a shell of his usual self towards the end of the Bulls' championship run, as his brutal back pain caused him to act as a decoy in Game 6 of those NBA Finals. With that being said, Scottie's health recovered almost completely in time for the 1998-99 season. The biggest piece of evidence for that statement is the fact that Scottie didn't miss a single game for the Rockets throughout the entirety of his 98-99 season. But it is worth mentioning that Pippen looked as if he had lost a small step due to his increasing age, as he averaged nearly 5 points per game less with the Rockets, and his efficiency from the field took a bit of a dip as well. His Rockets only made it to the first round of the playoffs, where they were eliminated by Shaq and Kobe's Lakers. In that postseason, Scottie was quite inconsistent. For example, in Game 2, he completely disappeared, scoring only 3 points on 0 of 7 shooting in 37 minutes of action. But in the very next game, he put up a career performance, dropping 37 points, 13 rebounds, and 4 assists, while playing all 48 minutes in a blowout victory. So at the very least, Scottie was extremely streaky at this point in his career, but to a certain extent, that was always an aspect of his game throughout his playing days. In conclusion, Pippen would have definitely lost a step in 1999, and wouldn't have been as much of a sure thing as Michael Jordan. Now let's look at Dennis Rodman. Of the Bulls' three-headed monster, Rodman was the oldest player, and if the Bulls were to make it all the way to the NBA Finals in 1999, Rodman would have been 38 years old before that series even started. Generally speaking, players in the 90s didn't age as gracefully as they do today, especially a guy like Rodman, who leaned heavily upon his strength, quickness, and athleticism. Of the three stars, his decline in basketball skills was certainly the most evident. Some people forget this, but he was losing some of his edge even in the 1998 postseason. In that final series against Utah, Rodman played more than 30 minutes in only 2 out of the 6 games. Along with that, in only 2 out of those 6 games did he reach double-digit rebounds. This decline was not only evident in his level of production, but it was also evident to Phil Jackson, which is why he was significantly decreasing his minutes. Just like Scottie Pippen, Dennis Rodman actually played in the 1998 to 1999 season for another team, as Dennis was a member of the Los Angeles Lakers. The thing is, it's really difficult to gauge what player Rodman would have been on the Bulls in 1999 based on what he was for the Lakers that season. To put it simply, Rodman's stint in Los Angeles was a nightmarish roller coaster. They won their first 10 games straight with Dennis in the purple and gold, but once he became a disruption in the locker room, things became dysfunctional soon after that. Rodman was saying that he needed vacation time in Vegas, while claiming that Kobe and Shaq were jealous of his luxurious lifestyle. Kobe and the rest of the organization were questioning his commitment to the team, and Shaq is on record for saying that Rodman was the worst teammate that he's ever had. After Rodman had missed yet another Lakers practice, LA's management became fed up with his antics and released the star forward just as the playoffs were set to begin. Now here's the thing, Kurt Rambis was filling in as the Lakers' interim head coach and was completely unqualified to handle all of these egos. With the psychologically brilliant Phil Jackson as the head coach, and with Michael Jordan and Scottie as familiar teammates, I don't see Rodman having these same issues with the Bulls in 1999. In conclusion, the Bulls would have had a productive Rodman in 1999, but he would have certainly been a significant step slower and less productive than the team was accustomed to. So now that we've looked at the Bulls' 3 stars, let's dive into the details of the 98 to 99 basketball season as a whole. What people often forget is that the 98 to 99 basketball season was a lockout-shortened season, where only 50 regular season games were played, compared to the usual 82. Now at first glance, you would think that a shortened season would actually work as an advantage to an older Chicago Bulls team, who could greatly benefit from more nights off. I honestly don't think that could be farther from the truth. The key detail here is that because of the lockout, regular season basketball games didn't start until February 5th, 1999, which is roughly 4 months later than when basketball season usually starts. Due to this, the NBA schedule was way more brutal than ever before, as each team had to play 50 games in just 90 days. Instead of just back-to-backs, in many cases, teams had to play games on 3 straight nights. This was a brutal schedule for everyone, but for a very old team like the Bulls, who had just played basketball for 3 long championship seasons, this highly condensed season would have been especially draining. Now before you completely write off the Bulls for the unfavorable schedule, consider this. The strength of the competition certainly wasn't as formidable in the Eastern Conference compared to years past. Patrick Ewing had an ongoing Achilles injury that forced him to sit out in the playoffs. Shaquille O'Neal had left Orlando for Los Angeles several years earlier, and the top-seeded Miami Heat were shockingly eliminated in the first round by the 8th-seeded New York Knicks. Eventually, it was that 8th-seeded Knicks who made it to the finals out of the East, even though they were without arguably their best player, Patrick Ewing. Simply put, the Eastern Conference was wide open for the Bulls' taking. And even if the Chicago group wasn't as good as any of their 6 previous championship teams, I still believe they would have been good enough to get through a relatively weak Eastern Conference on their way to the NBA Finals. The thing is, waiting for them in the finals would have been the extremely formidable San Antonio Spurs. Now it is worth mentioning that the Spurs and Michael Jordan's Bulls faced off twice in the 1998 regular season. And although both games were very close, Chicago won both matchups. San Antonio was even better in 1999 though, as they had lost only 1 game throughout the Western Conference playoffs on their way to the finals. Along with that, San Antonio was extremely strong where the Bulls were weak, in the painted area. The Twin Tower combination of Tim Duncan and David Robinson would have had the size to give the Bulls nightmares. And if it wasn't the 6'7" Rodman trying to slow them down, it would have been some big like Bill Wennington, who would be on his knees praying for mercy. San Antonio was also the #1 ranked defense throughout the 1999 season, and by no small margin either, as they were consistently allowing the fewest points in the paint. I understand Jordan never lost in the NBA Finals before, but this would have been his greatest test yet. as Rodman was on reduced minutes and an already tired Bulls team had just got through the most grueling schedule they've ever experienced. When you consider how Pippen lost a step, Rodman lost a step, and the favorable matchups in the paint for San Antonio, I see the Spurs winning this series in 6 or 7 games. Now again, it's Michael Jordan in the finals, so maybe he ultimately finds a way to get it done. I think it's unlikely, but who knows? Maybe someone would have personally offended him before the series, in which case all bets would be off. So here's the deal. My channel focuses primarily on basketball history. Although I occasionally discuss topics related to the modern game, my brand focuses on generations past. Because of this, most of my viewing audience tends to be boomers and Gen Xers. I imagine many of you guys aren't aware of this ongoing narrative on TikTok and Twitter, and sometimes even here on YouTube. Every day, more and more people are beginning to claim that Wilt Chamberlain's 100-point game never happened. As for myself personally, I do believe that this game happened, and I'll explain why in this video. But at the very least, I can understand why there's some recent skepticism from some modern NBA fans. For one, a 100-point game is so far from anything we've ever seen. We saw Kobe give one of the greatest performances of all time when he dropped 81 points in 2006. And even then, he was still a whopping 10 baskets short of eclipsing Wilt's total. The other reason for the skepticism is the fact that none of Wilt's 100-point game was caught on film. We have a box score and some personal testimonies of what his teammates and opponents witnessed, but not a single highlight. This has led some people to believe that the whole thing is simply a made-up fairy tale. Now, I'm all for a good conspiracy because newsflash, people lie. And I think it's always good to use critical thinking when you're told to believe something. As for myself personally, I'm obviously not old enough to have lived through that time. Since I was not there on that day, I cannot say beyond a shadow of a doubt that this game actually happened. But I can at least explain why I believe it did. Here are my 5 reasons why I believe Wilt scored 100 points. Point number 1. 100 points isn't actually as crazy as it sounds. The season that Wilt allegedly scored 100 points, teams were averaging 118.8 points per game. That is literally the highest scoring season of NBA history. Not only did Wilt average 50 points that season, but Oscar Robertson averaged a 30-point triple-double. And the Lakers' Elgin Baylor averaged 38.3 points per game, which is the highest scoring average by anyone other than Wilt. Simply put, offense was absurdly inflated in 1962, and that's because the pace of play was at a blistering speed. Even without 3-point shots, teams were able to produce so much offense, simply because of the sheer amount of possessions that they had. Here's something else to consider. Wilt Chamberlain wasn't scoring that many points in 1962 simply because he was better than everyone else, but it was also because he was playing so much more than everyone else. You see, heading into the 1961 to 1962 season, Frank McGuire had just been hired to be the head coach of the Philadelphia Warriors. According to McGuire, he had a private meeting with Wilt before the season began, and in that meeting, he asked Wilt how many minutes he would like to play per game. And to that, Wilt responded by saying, "I never want to go to the bench." As surreal as it sounds by modern day standards, Frank honored that request from Wilt. Other than a game where Chamberlain had been ejected, he played every single minute of every single game in the 1961 to 62 regular season. Wilt averaged 50.4 points in 1962, but his per 36-minute stats reduced that scoring average to a more comprehensible 37.4. Michael Jordan famously averaged 37.1 points per game in 1987, but the thing is, he only averaged 40 minutes per game, and if you prorate his minutes to 48 per game, then MJ's scoring average increases to 44.5 per game. So just by looking at the minutes and at these stats, you can start to see how Wilt's scoring isn't quite as insane as it sounds on the surface level. Another thing to consider is that Wilt Chamberlain was absurdly hot heading into the 100-point game. It was actually his 4th straight game where he had scored at least 60 points. And in a game just several months earlier, he had scored 78 points. At the time, many writers were starting to speculate that he might eventually score 100 points. So although it was amazing, it wasn't really the most surprising thing to happen in basketball. Now here's the other thing. Wilt allegedly scored 100 points against the New York Knicks on March 2nd, 1962 in Hershey, Pennsylvania. The Knicks were one of the worst teams in the league defensively, as they were allowing roughly 120 points per game. But as bad as the Knicks were on defense, they were even worse the night that Wilt was going up against them. You see, the Knicks' usual starting center that season was a 6'10 player in his 6th year, named Phil Jordan. According to reports, Phil had been out partying the night before and was vomiting prior to tip-off. Because of this, Phil sat out of that game. This means that Wilt was going up against the Knicks' backup center, Darrell Imhoff. Darrell was 6'10", but he was also a skinny second-year player who wasn't accustomed to defending starting centers, let alone Wilt Chamberlain. Seeing how Wilt always played 48 minutes, he was gonna be guarded by the backup of the backup. When Darrell Imhoff went to the bench, the player who then had to defend Wilt was a 6'9" rookie forward, Cleveland Buckner. So again, when you consider that the Knicks sucked defensively, the starting center was out, and Wilt was spending a large portion of the game up against an undersized rookie who was out of position, then yeah, it's not really surprising that this happened to be the night that he allegedly scored 100 points. Some will say that the craziest and most suspicious part is that he went 28 of 32 from the free throw line. At first glance, yeah, that looks really odd, coming from a player who's a career 51% foul shooter. But here's the thing, bad free throw shooters getting in a good rhythm is not something completely unheard of. Shaq was also one of the worst free throw shooters in NBA history, and in 3 games of his career, Shaq made at least 12 free throws without missing any. Giannis isn't a tremendous free throw shooter either, yet he's gone 17 of 17 from the line twice in his career. It's also worth mentioning that Wilt was an extremely streaky and inconsistent free throw shooter. Sometimes he would be solid, and sometimes he would be terrible. One season of his career, he shot 38% from the free throw line, and on another, he shot 61%. His inconsistencies were so confusing that he eventually started visiting a therapist to help him with his foul shooting. Knowing this history about Wilt, and knowing that other terrible foul shooters have had amazing nights from the line, it isn't all that shocking that he went 28 of 32 on the best night of his career. So again, this all isn't as crazy as it sounds. So let's press on. Point number 2. The game not being filmed was actually quite normal. To put it simply, the NBA was not very popular in the 1960s. Sure, some games were on television, but those were usually NBA playoff games with a tape delay. This game, on the other hand, was just a monotonous regular season matchup involving one decent and one terrible team. Back then, technology was nowhere close to what it is today. Nobody had smartphones, and very few people even had cameras. For the people who had cameras, they weren't usually some small and compact packages back then, but they were actually quite large and expensive, especially when they were filming video. Ask yourself this, how many full-length Wilt Chamberlain games can you find on YouTube that are older than 1967? If you can find any, I'm willing to bet that 99% of them were playoff games. For goodness sake, we don't even have all of Michael Jordan's games on film from his rookie season. Try to find his first regular season game against the Portland Trail Blazers. You can't. I know this because I recently made a video about it. and Jordan was a rookie 2 decades after the 100 game took place. Acting like it's some sort of conspiracy that we don't have the footage of a routine regular season game in 1962 is just silly. Point number 3, the era of America they played in. Players like Bill Russell and Wilt Chamberlain have spoken at length about their experiences as a black player in the NBA in the 1960s. If someone made up a 100-point performance, why would they do that? You're telling me that a league that was owned by white men, with white viewers of the game in the 1960s, lied on behalf of a black man? Yeah, I don't see how that makes any sense. Something else to consider is how the NBA would want this game to be on film. What benefit does the league have by not having footage of the greatest scoring performance in its history? Why would they make that up? If anything, they might stage the performance with a scripted outcome. That way, they have it on film to draw interest to the sport. But the fact that they don't have any footage at all probably drives the league office crazy. And I'm sure they wish Kobe's 81 was actually the top scoring performance. That way, they can monetize it and promote it as such. Point number 4, the credibility of the eyewitness. According to reports, roughly 4,000 people were in the arena when Wilt Chamberlain scored 100 points. But what almost no one ever mentions is the official statistician. This is Harvey Pollock, and he is in the Hall of Fame. Harvey passed in 2015, but before that, he worked as an official NBA statistician for over 60 years. At the time the game took place, Harvey was in the building as the game's statistician. He was a writer for the Philadelphia Inquirer and for the Associated Press. He is the one who tracked Wilt's stats, and he's also the one who handed Wilt a piece of paper with 100 written on it. And he's the man behind the camera who snapped the most iconic photo in basketball history. If there is anyone with the credibility to provide a trustworthy box score, it's Harvey Pollock. Point number 5, the radio broadcast. A lot of people who claim this never happened because it wasn't on film usually don't know that we actually have the fourth quarter's audio of the radio broadcast. You can listen to snippets of this audio on YouTube where the game is described in detail. Here's an audio clip of the moment Wilt scored 100.
167 to 146. Now let's see if they found somebody quick. Rodgers throws long to Chamberlain. He's got it. He's trying to get up. He shoots. No good. The rebound, Luckenbill. Back to Chamberlain. He shoots up. No good. In and out. The rebound, Luckenbill. Back to Rucklick. Into Chamberlain. He made it. A jumper dunk. He made it. The fans are all over the floor. They stopped the game. People are running out on the court. 100 points.
This radio broadcast is actually being preserved in the Library of Congress. So again, if this was all a lie, Harvey Pollock was in on it, the thousands of people who were at the game were in on it, the league was in on it, the government is in on it, and they staged a fake radio broadcast just to convince everyone of the lie. Because reasons, I guess. Friends, just admit it. It would make more sense that this game actually happened than it does about it being this big complex lie that involves thousands of separate individuals who are all complicit. So what do you guys think? Are you still skeptical? I look forward to hearing your thoughts in the comment section below. Thanks for watching as always. Make sure to like and subscribe for more basketball content, and I'll see you guys in the next video.